Chapter 126. Old Hutch threw Lionel out when they reached the training ground. A normal person might have fallen and rolled a couple times, but Lionel was able to regain his bearing and land on his feet, a helpless expression in his eyes. The old man walked to the side toward a rack of weapons. Well, one might call it a rack of weapons, but it was more accurate to call it a rack of machetes. This old man apparently didn't allow any other weapons to enter his sight. The training ground was old and dilapidated. It was located in the basement of a place Lionel could only assume was Old Hutch's home. The ground was built of broken concrete, the ceilings were covered in half-shattered light bulbs that probably hadn't appeared in a home since the 20th century, and there was a faint musty smell of sweat that hung in the air. "Old Hutch, I've told you again and again that I have no interest in using a machete as my weapon. I use spears." The machete is a man's weapon. You'll be damned if you're going to waste your talent." The old man snorted but then smiled. "That said, if you show me a bit of your skill, I might change my mind." Lionel was exasperated. This back-and-forth conversation sounded like it was the first time they were having it, but the truth was that this had happened 2 times before already. However, Lionel was really reaching the end of his rope this time. The more time he spent with this old man, the less adorable he thought he was and the more pissed off he got. The first few times, it might have been a funny story to tell in the future, but now it was becoming an annoyance that was ruining his future plans. Aina was in who knows how much danger right now. Miles and Simeon were still sucking air and Lionel had no idea what plot the latter was potentially laying down. After all, he didn't believe that Gorillman had popped up out of thin air. And Lionel still had no idea where his father was. Fine. Lionel's furious gaze calmed to the point of lacking ripples. His abrupt change caused Old Hutch to raise his brows. He had expected Lionel to react just the same as he had the previous 2 days, disdaining to fall for his taunts. Over the past 2 days, Lionel had completely ignored the old man, only casually brandishing a machete to get him off his back. But now, Lionel had reached the limit of his patience. With a flip of his palm, a silver rod appeared in his hand. He stood tall, his tranquil gaze bearing down on the old man. Old Hutch looked toward the rod in curiosity. "That's what you call a spear?" "I'd prefer not to kill an old man just seeking companionship," Lionel said indifferently. Old Hutch blinked before bursting into an uproarious laughter. "Kill me? I knew it. You really are an overconfident little brat." The old man might have wanted to say more, but Lionel had already moved. His body was lithe and flexible. Somehow, despite moving in a straight line, it felt as though he had cut off all paths of retreat. "Oh." The curiosity of Old Hutch was suddenly piqued. With a crooked grin, the old man stepped forward, swinging his machete down. It seemed like a casual movement, but Lionel could feel the weight of a mountain behind it. This old man was strong. However, Lionel wasn't the same as he was just a few days ago. He had always felt that he was missing something when it came to imitating the primitive woman, but now he knew what it was. It was flexibility. Though men had certain advantages when it came to martial arts, so too did women. The primitive woman especially seemed to move as though her bones were made of water and her flesh was carved of dew. That sort of flexibility was exactly what Lionel had been missing this whole time. However, flexibility wasn't something one could casually improve upon. It took years of consistency to reach such a point. And even those who could boast great flexibility would show decline in their abilities if they slacked off. Luckily for Lionel, after forming his 2-star constitution, his body had been remolded. In everything beside his size and strength, he was practically like a newborn baby, allowing him to lay an even better foundation of flexibility for himself. Not only did this allow him to break through to the advanced grade 1 designation, but it allowed him to imitate the movements of the primitive woman to a much greater degree. Bang! The tip of Lionel's rod perfectly met the old man's blade edge. However, instead of rebounding off of each other, they seemed to become stuck, causing Lionel's eyes to widen. He pulled his rod back, deftly dodging Old Hutch's follow-up strike, but the result was the same. Lionel's brow furrowed, his gaze becoming more serious. This time he no longer held back. A rain of piercing strikes came at the old man from all sides. Lionel's speed was inconceivable, fluttering around the old man as though his stamina was endless. His rod fell like droplets of rain, blurring shadows of silver streaking across the room as he attacked the man from all angles. Yet, no matter what he did, his rod always seemed to become stuck to Old Hutch's machete as though they were 2 parts destined to be fitted together. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He was shocked by the ability of this old man. Even relying on the skills of the primitive man and woman, he seemed completely unable to find an opportunity to break through his defenses. With a flicker of his eyes, the rod in Lionel's hands vanished, only to be replaced by a true spear. His aura completely changed and the pressure bearing down on Old Hutch multiplied several-fold. The old man couldn't help but blink in surprise. In a moment, his casual appearance became serious as his feet finally began to shift. As Lionel's blood boiled, his power seemed to multiply. He was completely immersed in the feeling. He could almost smell the old man's defeat. His heart yearned for it. He wanted nothing more than victory. It was maybe only at this moment that it became clear that it wasn't that Lionel didn't have any ambition, but rather that he only had this simple wish: to always win. Nothing else mattered. Seeing the look in Lionel's eye, despite the pressure on him, the old man grinned. "What a good kid. Unfortunately, you're still several decades too young to think of defeating me." Suddenly the man's aura changed as well. Though it was just the faintest of light, Lionel's senses were too sharp to miss the slight glow that coated the old man's blade. The machete's edge perfectly met the tip of Lionel's spear. The spear's prism-like tip stopped in the air for but a moment before it was split. In fact, the machete continued down and would have chopped Lionel's hand off had Old Hutch not shown mercy. Lionel's steps paused, looking at his ruined spear with a shocked gaze. His breath hung heavily in the air as his chest heaved. It was only now that he realized he had been battling the old man for a few hours and was exhausted. But he didn't have a mind to think of that. Force. That was definitely force. But it was different at the same time. Blade force? Chapter 127. Lionel was astonished. This force could be used beneath the disruption of the towers? He didn't know much about force-strengthening deviations, nor had he ever seen one. But he was quite certain that what he had just seen was blade force. Lionel's father had said that there were certain things about the spear domain heirloom that he wasn't allowed to know until he grasped spear force, but even to this day he had still not yet grasped it. Who would have known that this damned old man would have long since comprehended it? At this point, Lionel came to another understanding. The old man's strength wasn't because of an ability or because of some special food. The reason his body was so strong was precisely due to his blade force. From Lionel's minor understanding, force-strengthening deviations weren't as simple as just making one's weapon more powerful. First of all, not all of them were related to weapons. And, secondly, even those that were could grow and nurture the body, strengthening it over time. The old man must have comprehended blade force a very long time ago, likely even before the metamorphosis, allowing his body to be much stronger than others. In this case, his strength made much more sense. When a force-strengthening deviation was comprehended, it would take form in the ethereal glabella, exactly like Lionel's stars. In fact, the stars in Lionel's ethereal glabella could be classified as force-strengthening deviations as well. It was just that whereas spear force would make a spear's attack more potent, the stars in Lionel's mind nurtured his spirit and quickened his recovery of it. Hearing Lionel's words, Old Hutch was stunned before he broke out into laughter. "So you know about blade force, little brat? Not bad, not bad. I have indeed comprehended blade force. I was 42 years old back then, now I'm almost 150. Lionel felt a bit numb when he heard this. Though technology had extended life expectancy from the 21st century to the 25th, a normal lifespan only went from 80 years to about 120. However, he had never heard of a 150-year-old man capable of jumping around like a spry monkey. At the same time, Lionel finally felt a heartfelt respect for the old man. Comprehending force-related abilities back when Earth was still a third-dimensional world was difficult beyond imagining. This old man's talent in blade arts was most definitely outstanding. "Old Hutch, teach me how to comprehend spear force and I'll participate in the tournament for you." Lionel's pale green eyes shone brightly. For a moment, they were like lanterns in the dull light of the basement, boring holes into the old man's body. However, instead of receiving the answer he thought he would, Lionel saw Hutch frown for the first time in the 3 days he had known him. "Morales, do you think comprehending blade force is a joke? I thought before, when you were insisting on using the spear, that you had some lingering attachments to it. This is why I was willing to let you show me your talent. But, from what I see, you have no real attachments to the spear at all. You didn't even react when I destroyed your weapon. How could you possibly comprehend spear force with your current mindset? How could you gain the acknowledgement of a weapon if you don't love it?" "Love it?" Lionel's expression changed. Did he love the spear? The simple answer was no. It was a weapon he randomly picked up only because it was convenient. He had snatched it from a small gang who dared to speak inappropriately of his Aina. After that, he just so happened to learn that he had a spear-related lineage factor, so he stuck with the spear. It wasn't more complicated than this for him. But even setting this aside, Lionel couldn't understand why it was that the old man said he had to love his spear to comprehend spear force. None of this made any sense. He couldn't find a logical reason for why love would be necessary to the equation. If it was about this, then didn't that mean Lionel would never comprehend spear force? It wasn't like he could fake his love for a weapon, right? If he learned that he had a sword or machete or bow and arrow lineage factor right now, he wouldn't hesitate to leave the spear behind. To him, the spear was just a tool. Why was there a need to love it? Seeing Lionel's changing expression, the old man shook his head. If it was so easy to pass on comprehensions like this, nothing in the world would be difficult. After a moment, Lionel took a deep breath. Old Hutch, show me your blade force just one more time. Lionel's mind was difficult for others to understand. He was a kind soul, but he was equally as cold and calculating. He had a soft heart, but he couldn't stand losing. He was capable of feeling pity that his spear was now destroyed, but he couldn't feel that heartbroken emotion Old Hutch expected from him. Old Hutch's initial instinct was to reject, but after seeing Lionel's staunch gaze, he sighed. Fine, fine. I will show you once more. Consider it repayment for kidnapping you. Oh, so you're aware that you kidnapped me too, huh? Though he said this, Lionel still felt a sense of loss. He could see that Old Hutch had lost interest in him after seeing him exert his spearmanship. It wasn't because he wasn't talented enough or because he wasn't skilled enough, it was rather because he didn't care about the weapon in his hand. At such thoughts, Lionel could only shrug. He couldn't force himself to have emotions he didn't have. But that lit a fire in his heart nonetheless. He had to love his weapon to comprehend spear force? Bullshit. He would show this damned old man who had been annoying him all this time that he needed no such thing. A vast, boundless aura shrouded the basement room as Lionel focused his entire being on the machete in Old Hutch's hands. He didn't even notice that Hutch's eyes flickered with killing intent he quickly suppressed. This damned brat, if I didn't stop myself in time, his aura would have made me lash out to kill him. I thought I was on the battlefield meeting a formidable opponent for a second. Old Hutch shook his head. Still, you have so much talent yet you're wasting it. You place so many things below your vision so you hardly care about anything at all. I want to teach you a lesson, but am afraid that our Slayer Legion really doesn't have many at your age who can defeat you. But I won't bring those brats out. If I did, they would at most be able to match you. By then, you would think that maybe the road you're on is fine, when the reality is that you should be far better than them. You're hampering your own progress. In that case, it'll allow you to despair for a bit. Without humbling yourself, reaching the pinnacle is impossible. A violent surge of wind whipped around the training grounds, leaving Lionel in a trance. Chapter 128. On that day, the southern lookout was in an uproar. It might have even been more accurate to say that a tempest of rage had swept over it, stifling them to the point that they couldn't wait to vent their anger on somebody. One might think that this rage was due to some actions the Empire took against them. After all, this was the mighty Slayer Legion. They were an organization created for the sake of taking down the behemoth that ruled Earth. Who else could enrage them so much if not their sworn enemy? But reality was cruel and usually very far from expectations. This time around, the entity that had enraged them wasn't the mighty Empire at all, but rather a little boy of barely 18 years old. In fact, this boy had only joined them for all of 3 days, yet managed to claim all of their ire. First, it was said that he was taken under the wing of Hacker Hutch, the very man who smacked the face of Supreme Miguel in public. If it was only this, maybe the young man could dodge the guilt by association label. However, what came next was even worse. A recording of the young man saying that he could rank first among the promising youths even with Hacker Hutch's training was released, leaving the young men and women of the Slayer Legion fuming. As though that wasn't enough, just today the young man's alias was finally released. Everyone knew that all those who could list on the promising future rankings were all youths with great potential that had caught the eye of various higher-ups. The truth was that not everyone could appear on the list just because they wanted to. If one wanted to have their progress tracked and their feats seen by all, it was necessary to gain the acknowledgement of an official of at least the commander rank, a step above Joseph. Only upon receiving this recommendation would others start paying attention to you. In addition, your name would appear at the bottom of the promising future rankings. In order to protect these youths, aliases were chosen. In addition, whenever appearing in public, each of these youths would wear specialized masks created by the research and technology units of the Slayer Legion. The name one chose was incredibly important. After all, it would follow them for a lifetime. Choosing a name was akin to branding yourself. However, who could have imagined that that arrogant prick would choose the name, Indomitable? Compared to the other names on the rankings that were usually formed of word couplets or poetic sayings, the singular word at the very bottom stood out to everyone. When this was coupled with the news they had been receiving over the last few days, it was easy to guess what the public opinion toward the young man Indomitable was. As for the man in question, Lionel himself, he would likely want to cry tears if he was aware. But the truth of the matter was that he wasn't. As for the name? Of course he wasn't the one who chose it. In fact, he wasn't even aware of what was happening. He was completely engrossed in his spear. One would think that if he was practicing he would be testing out his movements, maybe redoing the same attack again and again. But Lionel was actually frozen in place. Ever since Old Hutch performed the last move, Lionel hadn't moved a single inch. He stood there staring into space. His actions caused the old man to sigh and shake his head. Sometimes the old wanted to pass on their wisdom to the young, but would the young always listen? Unfortunately, there were some things in life that could only be learned through trial, error and continuous failure. He believed that Lionel's attempts were foolish and had even told the little brat as much, but Lionel obviously wasn't listening. What he wasn't aware of, though, was that in his mind, Lionel was replaying his long battle with the old man over and over again. Then he would replay his final demonstration of blade force before cycling it all back to the beginning again. Lionel didn't believe it. Everything he had learned about force was so logical up until now. Even the energy itself was rooted in concepts of quantum physics. He didn't believe that something like blade or spear force suddenly became so arbitrary. Unlike what the old man was thinking, Lionel didn't actually disregard his words. In fact, Lionel believed that the old man wasn't lying to him. Or, at the very least, he believed he wasn't lying. And this thought alone was enough for Lionel. What was it? What was it that a veteran like Old Hutch could confuse for such an arbitrary feeling? What could trick him to such an extent? Well, that wasn't what he was talking about. He meant unconditional love. That's the kind of feeling he has for his machete. It was a small difference in wording, but the moment Lionel had the thought, his eyes shone like two stars. Unconditional love. Unconditional love. The root of unconditional love is unconditional trust. It's based in instinct. A mother or father loves their child simply because the baby is theirs. On the surface, it seems no more complicated than this. However, this instinct is still rooted in logic. It's the will to see their offspring grow, to continue their bloodline, to not have their families come to an end by their hands, to continue to leave their mark on history. The light in Lionel's eyes grew brighter and brighter. At one point, they became like burning torches, the paleness of his eyes disappearing to give way to two flashing emerald gems that could light the night sky. Lionel felt like he understood something. What Old Hutch thought of as unconditional love was just an unconscious reliance on his own talent for blade arts. He trusted his own talent to the point it could be described as instinctual, as a part of himself. This trust, this love, this unconditional love, and further, this unconditional trust, is what allowed him to comprehend blade force in such a poor environment. Lionel, too, could rely on this unconditional love. If he fell back and stopped trying to find logical reasonings at every corner, he could have relied on his lineage factor to comprehend spear force no differently than Hutch relied on his talent. In fact, by now, Lionel's spear force could have long since surpassed Hutch's blade force by leaps and bounds. All he had to do was have that same unconditional trust in his own talent, to blindly follow it and allow it to lead the way. But this wasn't the kind of person Lionel was. He didn't like the feeling of being led by the nose, even if it was his own bloodline. He liked to understand the root of things, to comprehend them to the point of making them his own. By now, Lionel understood. The reason his lineage factor had had such a small effect on him to this point was because he wasn't trusting it as much as he should. He didn't have the blind faith in it someone else would have. At the same time, it made sense why his father had left so little about spear force in the dictionary. There was no need to explain spear force because Lionel's lineage factor should have told him about everything he needed to know. This love Hutch spoke about wasn't his path. He could rely on his lineage factor, but he didn't want to. He wanted to comprehend his lineage factor, to unveil all of its secrets and allow it to lay bare before him. Rather than relying on instinct, he wanted to rely on logic, on reasoning. It might have sounded very fancy, but it boiled down to one point. He wanted to win. He wanted to be indomitable. Chapter 129. On this day the southern lookout was bustling. Actually, it could be said that the past week was easily the liveliest time of the year. Not only was it the time for the agreed-upon biannual check-in, but it was also the time for the gathering of promising youths. Many saw the check-in at the lookouts to be a small vacation from the days of putting their lives on the line. It could be said that this gathering acted as the main attraction, placing a nice bow on the events of the last week. At this time, many had come together toward the center of the Venice-like city, ready to enjoy all the excitement. The arena at the center of the southern lookout was quite beautiful indeed. It seated about 10,000 people normally, but this only counted the seats available directly on the property. To the sides of the arenas, there were many artificial rivers of water that allowed boats to float around. If the seating capacity of these various steel behemoths was taken into account, the number of spectators could easily reach 50,000. Though this number of individuals might not necessarily come out to watch usually, the events of the past week were too shocking. How could any of them bear to miss this event? As a result, let alone 50,000 people, there were even more trying to push their way in. Those with special water-based abilities were making quite a sum of money today, just taking in these people to have a look. As for who these people had come for? Who else if not that young man known as Indomitable? On the arena stage, there were already several masked young men and women who stood silently. Their posture could be considered perfect and each of them had the bearing of a military man or woman. Their discipline was immaculate. Each of their masks held a different symbol that represented their title. One might have pictured a roaring lion, another might have a slithering snake, some had images more abstract painted on theirs, while yet some others were completely straightforward and opted for words. There were about 40 youths present. The actual number of promising youths assigned to the Southern Lookout was easily double this. However, not every youth on the ranking would come forward. After all, this was an organization created for the sake of taking down the empire. Not all of them had the time to spare out of their dangerous daily lives to take part. Usually, barely 20 would appear to put on a good show for the masses. But this time double that number had come, and for obvious reasons at that. These kids are quite anxious it seems. To think that they didn't come out when we provided such good rewards, but are eager to now just because a little boy said a few words. A group of 3 stood in an overseer's box looking toward the arena. Amongst them there were 2 men and a single woman. Though they seemed smiling and reserved, it was obvious by the fact they had been chosen to oversee this battle that they were at the commander rank at a bare minimum. It can't be helped, the woman replied. They all have seniors that give them treasures like the ones we reward all the time. Plus, even though they're young, they understand the concept of protecting themselves. The less famous they are, the better it is for them. Stepping forward for short-term benefits is unwise. You say this like we're the bad guys for trying to give them a little incentive. I do find the whole rankings to be a bit silly. Why did we create them at all? You know that I was among the few who directly rejected the idea. We should be protecting these youths, not thrusting them into the spotlight like this. The woman clearly didn't like the proceedings. This was only the 3rd gathering to ever take place. After all, the promising rankings were only created after the metamorphosis. It was widely known that youths had greater potential during this evolutionary stage, so emphasis was placed on them. Regardless, this woman felt that this was only more reason to stop this practice, but it was too difficult to go against the tide. One of them men sighed. Violet Rain, the higher-ups have their own concerns as well. Earth's situation is quite precarious right now, not everything is as it seems on the surface. Hearing these words, the woman fell silent. She too knew that the behind-the-scenes matters weren't so simple. But even if there were logical reasons, she still found it to be a difficult pill to swallow. An event like today was exactly what she had been worried about. No matter how sensible they were, the young was still the young after all. They were only provoked just this little bit and look at how many of them had come out this time. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact the rise of Indomitable was too sudden, she was certain that even more would have come. Maybe all over 100 promising youths would have come this time had Lionel appeared just a little earlier. Though she didn't share this with anyone, the vigilance in her heart was raised by several levels. Who knew if this was a ploy by the Empire to learn more about the future pillars of the Slayer Legion? The reason she didn't dare to voice such concerns was precisely because of Hacker Hutch. Since Indomitable was tied to Hacker Hutch, it could be said that he was endorsed by the latter as well. Not many would believe that such a legend had betrayed them. But wasn't it exactly because of this that the plan would be so perfect? After all, it wasn't like retired officials of their legion hadn't become disillusioned to the point of defecting in the past. The path they as rebels walked was too perilous. Yes. I know how you feel. Well, today you might just get to see that kid you hate so much get his just desserts. Look up there, 2 in the top 5 actually remain behind. The man pointed toward 2 young people, one of which was a young man and the other of which was a young woman. The young woman wore a tight-fitting green tracksuit. The leggings clung close to her toned legs and her jacket was half unzipped, revealing a sports bra that held back her breasts. Though her chest couldn't be said to be large, it was still eye-catching, causing a few youths to look over and gulp down every so often. However, after seeing the green spiraling swirls painted onto the young woman's mask, none of them dared to harass her. They knew immediately that this was the new third ranked on the promising future list, Chasing Wind. The young man stood a few columns away from her, his back as straight as a javelin. His full, sturdy chest jutted out like 2 blocks of stone, pushing against his simple white shirt as he clasped his hands behind his back. His mask was covered in the image of a dark cloud. Everyone knew who he was by this symbol. He was the youth who had just been pushed down a spot by Chasing Wind, Thunderous Clap. However, though these two were here and had even looked around on several occasions, they only saw masks with symbols they recognized. The man named Indomitable was nowhere to be seen. Could it be that he would provoke them into coming like this then dodge responsibility himself? So, this plot is too sinister. An ugly expression twisted the image of the beautiful woman in the overseer box. But, at that moment, a hysterical laughter cut through the chatting voices of the crowd waiting for a show. "Old Hutch, let me go, damn it. I was so close." "Shut up, brat. You said that you would participate if I showed you my blade force one more time. Do you think I would let you miss this gathering? Dream on." A young man was sent tumbling into the arena, entering in as sorry of a state as one could imagine. He huffed a sigh and stood after his body stopped rolling, sending a glare toward the old man who had crossed water to bring him here. Force can be used to walk on water? So cool. Despite his glare, the young man was actually quite intrigued. Finally, seemingly noticing that this situation wasn't quite right, the young man looked up to find over 40 burning gazes looking toward him. The young man raised an eyebrow. Why do they all look like they want to eat me alive? Who else could this young man be if not Lionel? Chapter 130. The gazes of over 40 youths fell onto Lionel. When they saw that his mask had no markings on it at all, they immediately guessed that this man should be the so-called Indomitable. As for Lionel, he was as confused as ever. What had he done to attract such hatred? Is it because I was late? Lionel felt a wave of fatigue hit him all of a sudden. It was only now that he remembered he hadn't slept in almost 5 days. He had been diligently comprehending something when the old man suddenly appeared, grabbed his shoulder, then tossed him here. If it wasn't for his high spirit, staying awake for so long would be impossible even if his body was many times more powerful. Unfortunately, his spirit had taken quite a bit of a hit now. "Sorry I was late." These were the first words Lionel said, but they only made the gazes of the over 40 youths that looked toward Lionel burn brighter. This wasn't only because of what he said but also because they recognized his voice. It was the very same voice that said it could defeat them all even without Hacker Hutch's training. As for Lionel's words themselves, how could they take it seriously? In fact, they found it to be quite insulting. If his words didn't imply disregard, then what else could they imply? They had all gotten here early, all to teach Indomitable a lesson. Yet, not only did he not appear on time, making them wait for him, but they had all just heard his voice clearly. Even to this point he still hadn't wanted to come. Had it not been for old Hutch, he might have not come at all. How could they not feel unsatisfied? Seeing the atmosphere wasn't quite right, Lionel smiled bitterly and scratched the back of his head. But, at that moment, a yawn inadvertently came from his mouth, causing him to subconsciously cover his lips despite having a mask on. It couldn't be helped, he was too tired. However, what he had forgotten was that since he was wearing a mask, no one could see his sheepish grin. But they all very clearly heard his yawn. This made their already furious gazes spit fire. At this point, even if Lionel wanted to explain, no one would listen. The sound of a throat clearing rang over the arena. "Indomitable, I presume? Please take your place on the arena and we can begin." Lionel turned his head back toward the overseer box, seeing that the voice came from there, then complied. It seemed he really wouldn't be able to get out of this. He was usually well liked wherever he went. This could be said to be the first time in his life where he was truly public enemy number one for reasons that were completely out of his control. Though Lionel complied with the voice, his every action was under the scrutiny of too many people. His appearance in comparison to the perfect military form of the other youths on the stage with him stuck out like a sore thumb. It was clear that whether it was his posture or demeanor, he was lacking completely. He threw their perfect formation into disarray. His steps weren't even, his back was slouched, and his eyes were perpetually half-closed. As if that wasn't bad enough, he kept yawning. The flickers of deep disdain and disgust continuously came his way, but by this point, Lionel didn't have the mind to care for them. He had fallen into a trance once more, seemingly trying to grasp something that had just been within his reach. Over the last several days he had been trying to comprehend his lineage factor and by extension spear force, but he had ended up stumbling upon something completely different. It left him quite shocked, actually. In truth, he had almost completely forgotten about his infatuation with spear force. Unfortunately, his absent-minded gaze and his continuous yawning not only made him the public enemy of the youths, but also the crowd watching on. They hardly even paid attention to the commanders who were in charge of reading out the rules of the gathering. The more they paid attention to Lionel, the more he didn't seem to notice them, and the more enraged they became. Then, when they reached a tipping point, Lionel would yawn again, making veins bulge like slithering snakes on their foreheads. The first will be Indomitable, I assume you don't mind? At first, Lionel didn't register the words. After all, he didn't know his name was Indomitable now. He wasn't the one who chose the name. But after a moment, he seemed to recall that the woman who spoke from the overseer's box earlier had also said Indomitable when referring to him. He hadn't thought much about it because his mind was too sluggish to care for other things. But now he suddenly made the connection. Who, me? Lionel looked up, only to find several more glares aimed toward him. Sure. Yes. He hurriedly spoke. He had no idea what was going on, but he thought his best option was to agree, or else these people might really pounce on him. The woman in the overseer's box frowned. She had already had a poor impression of Lionel from the beginning, but his actions since coming here infuriated even her. Under Lionel's confused gaze, the other youths who had shared the stage with him cleared out and left, not forgetting to send a few more threatening gazes toward him. Toward this he could only be helpless. Am I supposed to leave too, or? Lionel hesitated. He was apparently supposed to go first, but he didn't know what he was supposed to do. Luckily he got an answer quite quickly. The ground separated to reveal a hidden underground passageway. Others couldn't see what was going on with just their eyes, but even with his weakened spirit, Lionel could tell that there was a small group of invalids coming toward him now, all of which were at the grade. He could see that there were a total of 5 of them. Am I supposed to defeat them? Lionel came to an understanding then. Since that was the case, everything was pretty straightforward then. In truth, Lionel's mind was groggy, all he really wanted to do was sleep. But whenever he had such thoughts, his curiosity got the best of him and he continued to study that weird feeling he grasped just a few days ago. Now that his mind had cleared once more due to this tournament and he didn't have that curiosity to distract him from his fatigue anymore, all he wanted to do was take a nap. The 5 grade invalids stalked their way up from the hidden underground passage. The crowd had been quite interested in seeing all of their weird mutations and quirks. After all, there was a high chance that invalids at the grade would have such oddities attached to them. But they didn't get much of a chance. With a flip of his hand, an otlotl appeared in Lionel's palm. With his increase in strength after forming a 2-star constitution, defeating grade invalids was as easy as a flick of wrist. 5 streaks of silver pierced through the air, leaving howling winds in their wake. A moment later they shot through 5 foreheads, blasting the grade invalids apart only for them to turn into several motes of light. Seeing that the task was done, Lionel couldn't refrain from yawning again. He went off to the side to find a place to rest. He didn't seem to notice the silence of the arena when he sat back down. In fact, he had just been feeling tired a moment ago, but instead of closing his eyes, he actually sank back into that absent-minded headspace. A light of fury flickered in the female commander's eyes. Indomitable is disqualified for breaking the rules. Unfortunately for her sanity, Lionel didn't seem to hear this either. Chapter 131. Lionel really hadn't heard this voice at all. In fact, his eyes were still vacant. The only thing that made it seem that he was awake was his occasional yawn. Still, it was as though the outside world had nothing to do with him. A rain of BOs came from the crowd. Clearly, they had been infuriated beyond reason. It was only after their rage became like a tempest that Lionel was startled awake and looked around in confusion. Why the hell are they booing? Lionel looked up toward the overseer's box, thinking that he might find a clue. But all he saw was a woman looking toward him with an infuriated gaze while the 2 men beside him had helpless expressions. This only made him more confused. What happened? Lionel mumbled these words to himself, but the youths who were nearby him heard them and couldn't take it anymore. You're still saying bullshit like that at this point? You're disqualified. If you were going to throw the gathering like this from the beginning, why the hell did you waste all of our times? The young man who spoke wore a mask painted with a fierce roaring lion. It was just that this lion, instead of having a brownish gold mane, was completely black. Someone more knowledgeable than Lionel would immediately recognize this young man as Roaring Black Lion. No one knew whether the name was chosen for this reason or not, but the young man did happen to be black. What wasn't covered by his mask or his clothes revealed dark skin with pulsing muscles beneath. He was a bit shorter than Thunderous Clap, but he was definitely stockier. Disqualified. Lionel blinked in confusion. I broke the rules? What rule did I break? At this point, Lionel felt a little bad. He hadn't been paying attention when the female commander was listing the rules, so he didn't know what they were at all. Without knowing, he could only apologize. How could he refute if he didn't know what he was refuting? Lionel assumed that maybe he wasn't allowed to use weapons. If that was the case, he could only take this on the chin. He had only wanted to end his turn as quickly as possible so that he could rest, but it actually came back to bite him like this. Roaring Black Lion frowned when he heard Lionel's words. This was about the last question he had expected to hear. He, along with everyone else, assumed that Lionel had gotten himself disqualified on purpose. Treasures gained with zones are banned for this gathering. In order to maintain fairness, we can only choose weapons from the racks to the side. Oh. Lionel mumbled. That's unfortunate. Sorry about that, I must have missed it. Did that mean he got to go? This wasn't a bad result. After all, he had fulfilled his promise to the old man by coming here. Roaring Black Lion's lip twitched. Could it be that this young man really hadn't heard anything? He could only look on as Lionel stood and slowly walked toward the exit of the arena with an absent-minded gaze. He didn't seem to hear the torrent of booze raining down on him. If it was up to Lionel, as long as he participated in something, he would have liked to take first. However, he also wasn't the type of person who despaired in his failure either, not to mention the fact his mind was completely preoccupied by something else. Unfortunately for Lionel's thoughts of rest, would the madman Hutch really allow him off so easily? Hey little girl, directly allow this brat into the next round. The three commanders in the overseer's box was suddenly stunned by the presence of a fourth person. Regardless of which of them it was, they had no idea when someone had appeared in their midst. The woman was the first to recover from her shock and register the old man's words. Her expression flickered several times. No matter what thoughts she held close to her heart, she didn't dare to be disrespectful to Hacker Hutch. However, how could she go back on her word? She had just listed the rules and Lionel blatantly disregarded them. Now she was supposed to reinstate him? How could she do something like that? Taking a deep breath, the woman gathered up her resolve. Commander Violet Rain greets Supreme Hutch. Violet Rain saluted seriously. I cannot comply with Supreme's orders. Indomitable has broken the rules. We cannot cause the integrity of the gathering to suffer. The two men by Bridget had weird expressions upon hearing this. Wasn't she disparaging the gathering just a few minutes ago? When had it become so important to her? This is an order, Hutch said without a care, finding a couch to lie on and plopping down. It was unknown where he got it, but he had carried a large pizza in with him and started munching away without a care in the world. Fury lit Violet Rain's eyes. This was so unreasonable. Yes, it was unreasonable. But so what? These were Hutch's thoughts. Any army had a strict hierarchy. This was even more so for a rebel army like the Slayer Legion. The consequences for disobeying an official just one rank above was already steep, let alone someone 3 ranks above her like Hutch. Violet Rain's chest billowed with the waves of her anger. But what could she do? Other than her face reddening and her ears almost jetting out steam, there wasn't anything else. By this point, the audience below felt that the situation was getting weird. Lionel was already almost out of the arena and it had already been several minutes since his turn ended. Why was it that the overseer's box hadn't said anything about which of the promising youths was next? At that point, the forceful clearing of a throat could be heard over the arena. In truth, though it was as such, one could almost mistake it for the sounds of a dying cat. Who knew what kind of internal struggle the person who made the sound was undergoing? The previous decision has been revoked. A female voice spoke through gritted teeth. Indomitable will directly move on to the next round. After a moment of silence, the arena erupted. Gazes of indignation and fury fell on a particular young man and the overseer's box. This is bullshit. Just because he's the underling of a supreme? Rules don't matter anymore? At this point, the loudest voices were the youths near the stage. Their roars called out toward the overseer's box like a raging typhoon. If Lionel was already hated before, it could be said that maybe only the Emperor of the Ascension Empire was a greater enemy to them all now. And even then it was close. Chapter 132. Lionel kept walking in his absent-minded state. He really hadn't heard the words of Commander Violet Rain at all. He was immersed in his own world. In fact, he might have walked all the way out of the arena had he not suddenly felt that someone was standing in front of him. Oh? Lionel frowned and looked up. It was accurate to say that Lionel was quite tall. In fact, since his academy days he had grown another inch or so. Now he stood at 64. So, despite the fact the young man standing before him had quite an overbearing aura, Lionel, upon looking up, even despite his slouched back, stood taller. Seeing this, the young man narrowed his eyes, but his momentum didn't dampen in the slightest. When the crowd saw this young man confronting Lionel, their eyes blazed with passion. The rolling clouds painted over the young man's mask made his identity clear. They couldn't help but feel their blood boil, hoping that the young man would redress their grievances. "Is there a problem?" Lionel asked. "I only want to let you know one thing." The man's voice was like a thunderous boom. He didn't seem to be trying to speak loudly, but his voice naturally projected as though he was a man perfectly suited to lead. Lionel's first instinct was to think that this young man had a voice-related ability like Admiral Milan. However, Lionel's senses were far sharper than they had been in the past. He could even vaguely get a sense of a person's ability as long as they tapped into it, though not nearly as thoroughly as the dictionary. But this was still a good thing. After all, he couldn't always speak to the dictionary out loud, and letting others know about its existence might not be a good thing. This was all to say that Lionel felt that this young man's ability might not be so simple. "One thing?" Lionel asked in confusion. "I hope that you'll get yourself disqualified for the second round as well. Or else, if we meet on that stage, you'll make sure you leave on a stretcher." Lionel was stunned. In his life, this was the first time he had come across such a situation. After all, he lived in a society with rules and regulations. Maybe only when Conrad tried to kill James by throwing him out of a window did Lionel vaguely come across such a thing. But this was most definitely the first time someone had so blatantly said something like this to him. How could he not be left speechless for a moment? For a while, Lionel didn't seem to hear or feel anything. By the time the crowd's noise faded back into existence for him, the boos had become cheers. It was obvious they had heard the young man's words. "Thunderous clap, you're my idol. Teach him a lesson." Lionel came back to reality, realizing that this wasn't a dream. Is this the kind of place Earth had become now? People could just blatantly threaten another and even gain the cheers of a crowd as a result? Something within Lionel seemed to change at that moment. It wasn't anything large. In fact, he could summarize it just a single word: acceptance. If this was the world he lived in now, maybe that was fine too. "So there's a round two?" Lionel mumbled to himself. "I guess I was only disqualified for the first round then? If you're scared, then scram." Look at him, he didn't even dare to move after Thunderous Clap put him in his place. Maybe he'll leave the arena directly. Lionel mumbled to himself. But by now, Thunderous Clap had already walked away under a chorus of cheers. The crowd might very well have taken Lionel's pause as a sign of fear, but the truth was that Lionel had already returned to his own world. What a joke. Who was he? He was the greatest quarterback prospect in easily the last several generations. How many games had he played in enemy territory? Let alone these insults, he had heard 10, even 100 times worse. He had learned to tune it out a long time ago. But what the crowd missed in all those jeers was that the moment Lionel's heart settled down, blinding, flickering lights jumped within his eyes. Unlike in the past, these lights were real. It was to the point that if one had met Lionel's gaze now, they might even be blinded for a moment. Thunderous Clap's words had unlocked something within him. Lionel turned and walked back to his seat. He had no idea that the rules had been broken for him. In his mind, he had failed in the first round but received a chance at the second. In that case, he would sit and wait for his turn. He had no idea that he had gone from the coward who couldn't respond to Thunderous Clap, to the shameless young man who threw the face of all promising youths. Next, Thunderous Clap. Commander Violet Rain's voice seemed to be far more at ease now. It was obvious to most the Thunderous Clap had vented some of her rage for her, and in the coming round, if this Indomitable wasn't sensible, then she just might get to see a great show. She looked toward Hutch with a half-satisfied expression, but who would have known that old man wouldn't even be paying attention? In fact, he was still nibbling away at his pizza without a care in the world. At that moment, Thunderous Clap stood and walked to the stage. The ground opened up to reveal 5 more invalids. He sunk into a horse stance, his fists clasping against the sides of his body. Thunderous Clap isn't using his rod. He's making a point, obviously. Some shameless people only know how to cheat with the fancy weapons they get through nepotism. Ah. Show him who's truly indomitable. Even without your weapon you're his better. Thunderous Clap's eyes flashed as a low shout like his lips. The stage beneath his feet quaked and cracked as he shot forward, appearing before the first invalid in the blink of an eye. Bang, bang, bang. His body was like the center of a storm. Violent vibrations and cacophonic booms seemed to follow his every movement, leaving destruction in his wake. He passed through the group of invalids in a flash. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had happened, even when Thunderous Clap smoothed out the wrinkles of his clothes and everything fell into silence. But, in the next instant, bang! The 5 invalids combusted. It was as though someone had planted a bomb within their bodies, allowing them to explode from the inside out. The motes of light they became shot into the air under the pressure before slowly descending back toward Thunderous Clap. This sight alone made him look as though he was a favored child, basking in the rays of the skies. The atmosphere reached the peak. Thunderous Clap's performance caused the arena to erupt to the point the ground shook. Chapter 133. The crowd went wild, basking Thunderous Clap with praise. At this point, even most of the promising youths who usually would be blazing with battle intent right now felt proud. This was simply human nature. When one shares an enemy, previous petty disputes can be ignored. However, the subject of public outrage wasn't paying attention to these matters at all. He sat on the ground cross-legged, leaning on his thigh and supporting his head up from his chin with a hand. He stared blankly at the ground. From an outsider's perspective he seemed quite listless. But the tangible light that had been bouncing in his eyes only grew fiercer and fiercer as though he was slowly comprehending something new. Numerous gazes descended onto Lionel once more. But no one could see the odd phenomena with his head lowered. As for Thunderous Clap, after speaking those words to Lionel, he hadn't even bothered to cast another glance toward him. The first round continued, numerous youths going up one after another. The atmosphere was much better than it had been initially as many felt their anger having been vented, so a casual enjoyment of the gathering ensued. One after another the youths went up to show off their abilities. It turned out that defeating the invalids wasn't the true requirement. According to the rule Lionel missed out on, one was only meant to survive the confrontation for 10 minutes. Anything at and beyond this would be considered a pass. Though Lionel casually killed the 5 invalids, it could be said that he went above and beyond despite breaking the rules. Of course, this also meant that Thunderous Clap had also accomplished more than what was expected of him. Violet Rain, no matter what, you're a commander. Is there a need to look so happy? One of the male commanders by Violet Rain's side, a man who went by the code name of Mellow Trees, rebuked playfully. He could see that with each performance that surpassed Lionel's, this companion of his would smile wider and wider. I never knew that Violet Rain would hate a teenage boy so much. Violet Rain snorted and didn't say anything. Of course, this was because Old Hutch was still a small distance away and could most definitely hear their conversation. It was fine for them to tease her, but if she really said anything in affirmation, it was impossible to tell whether she'd have a good ending or not. Her happy expression became gloomy again upon hearing their words. But there was nothing much she could do. Luckily for her, the next youth was enough to make her smile again. Next, Chasing Wind. The crowd seethed with excitement once more as a young lady wearing a tight, green tracksuit made her way onto the stage. Her every movement was graceful and carried an air of charm, but it was very obvious that it wasn't her trying to be seductive. It was a natural feeling ingrained within her bones. It could be imagined that even in battle, she would still maintain the same graceful bearing. Chasing Wind casually looked through the weapon rack, testing out a few swords. Obviously, it seemed she had no intention of going barehanded like Thunderous Clap had. She felt no need to get involved in the dick measuring contest between men. Though that wasn't to say she wasn't dissatisfied with Lionel as well, she just chose to remain quiet about it. At least, these were her original thoughts. But she began to look upon Lionel quite curiously when she saw him remained unmoved through all of this. Others might have written it down as cowardice, but she thought there was something weird going on that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Still, she threw it to the back of her mind. Wouldn't she find out during the second round? The young lady picked a well-balanced short sword and made her way to the stage, standing calmly as though unblemished by the outside world. When the invalids appeared, her picturesque figure suddenly moved, flashing forward in a light gust of fragrant wind. Like Thunderous Clap's suitably thunderous performance, she, moving as light as a feather, painted the perfect picture of Chasing Wind. Whenever one watched her movements, they couldn't help but take in every bit of her actions. The beautiful twinkling of her eyes, the rhythmic swaying of her hips, the delicate grunts that left her lips. She fluttered between the invalids like a butterfly, her speed too quick for them to attack properly. Her sword left lines of silver in the air, drawing graceful arcs that passed by 5 necks as though going through air. The tips of her toes lightly landed on the ground, a small circle of wind and dust being pushed out as though clearing a place for her to land. How could such a beautiful woman be allowed to fall onto a dirty stage? Even nature itself wouldn't allow it. Without suspense, the cheers of the crowd erupted once more. Marry me, Chasing Wind. Marry you? On what basis exactly? Take a look at yourself in a mirror once in a while. I don't care. If I can't marry Chasing Wind, he'll stay single the rest of my life. Don't you think you guys are a bit too fanatical? You've never even seen her face before. For all you know, her eyes are slanted and her face is covered in pockmarks. The crowd within the vicinity of the middle-aged man who spoke these words looked at each other in a speechless moment before pouncing toward the man in unison as though they had agreed to it beforehand. That day there would no doubt be a man who left the arena beaten black and blue. Violet Rain watched Chasing Wind leave the stage with a gratified smile on her face. It was as though she was looking at a youthful version of herself. She didn't doubt that there'd be a day when Chasing Wind was a commander just like her. In fact, she would likely be promoted beyond that. This concludes the first round. Those who have qualified can now move on to the second and final round, of which there are 8 of you. These include Thunderous Clap, Chasing Wind, Roaring Black Lion, Seer, Falling Leaf, Erupting Volcano, Precious Moment, and Indomitable. A wave of boos rang. Chapter 134. Only one chapter today. I was kidnapped away for birthday-related matters, so this is all there is. The smile on Violet Rain's face grew brighter and brighter. It was finally time for this farce to come to an end. Now that the second round had come around, there was no longer any words to hide behind. A devious light flashed in her watery eyes as she turned on the voice projection system once more, having gotten her fill out of the crowd's boos. I will now explain the rules for the second round as I did for the first. One of the male commanders by Violet Rain's side had a weird expression hearing these words. They were supposed to share hosting duties, so it was meant to be his turn to explain things. They had done this a couple times before already, so Violet Rain should be familiar with the process. Whatever. The rules for the second round have always been the same anyway. It doesn't need to be me. However, he had only barely finished thinking this when he was suddenly stunned by the next words he heard. The second round this time will be a seeded elimination tournament where your performance from the first round will be taken into account. You will be split into seeds 1 through 8. The first battle will be between seed 7 and 8. The winner of the battle will go on to challenge seed 6, while the winner of that will go on to challenge seed 5. So on and so forth. In the end, whichever seed remains standing will be allowed to challenge the best performer from the first round. After being stunned a while, the 2 male commanders looked toward each other and smiled bitterly. Even if they were beaten to death, they wouldn't believe that this wasn't targeting a certain person. But since Violet Rain hadn't done anything too outrageous, they really couldn't say anything. Plus, it wasn't like they could make her retract the rules she had already set, right? They had already lost face once today after readmitting Lionel. The second round was indeed usually an elimination tournament. But it was a normal one in which everyone battled at once. 8 would become 4, then 2, then eventually 1. This modification of Violet Rain's was appearing for the first time in the history of the gathering. Unfortunately, since this was only the third gathering, no one picked up on the oddity. They only felt that the rules had changed, but they didn't think there was anything wrong with it. Like this, Violet Rain got away with it. Plus, even if things weren't like this, would the crowd really turn against Violet Rain for the sake of Lionel? If anything, they would give her their full support for dealing with the shameless man who dared to call himself indomitable. As for the man who was being targeted himself, he wasn't even aware. Lionel hadn't taken part in the other gatherings, so how could he know what was normal and what wasn't when even the fanatics in the crowd didn't? Violet Rain's smile grew as she continued. The bottom of the rankings will be decided by who lasted for the longest after crossing the minimum 10-minute requirements. As for those who had the ability to kill the 1 or more invalids, they will be even above that. Those at the very top will be decided by whoever defeated the 5 invalids the quickest. Like this, the seeds are as followed. First seed, Chasing Wind. Second seed, Thunderous Clap. Third seed, Roaring Black Lion. Fourth seed, Erupting Volcano. Fifth seed, falling leaf. Sixth seed, precious moment. Seventh seed, seer. And the eighth seed, indomitable. The crowd was silent for a moment before cheers erupted once more. Ah, serves him right. Good luck going through our gauntlet of geniuses, indomitable. Indomitable? More like indomitable. That was lame. Another fight broke out in the crowd. Violet Rain allowed the crowd to get rowdy to their heart's content before continuing. Once again, I will reiterate the rules and regulations. First, anyone who kills their opponent will be subject to judgment by military law. This is a time of war, remember that. Your sentence wouldn't be anything lighter than the death penalty. Second, only weapons from the racks provided can be used. She took her time to emphasize the word only, and for good reason. Those weapons are all of the C grade and can ensure fairness. Third, if I stop the battle for any reason, anyone who fails to obey in a timely fashion will once again be subject to military law. Disobeying the command of a superior officer is worth at least a demerit. This time, Lionel made it a point to listen to the rules so that he wouldn't make a mistake again. But, when he heard that the weapons of the rack were of the C grade to ensure fairness, he had a weird expression. Though no one could see it behind his mask. His otlotl and darts were treasures from he received after clearing the Mayan tomb zone. They were C grade treasures. So why was he disqualified? Toward this, Lionel could only scratch the back of his head and shrug his shoulders. It didn't seem to matter anymore. After all, she had said that only weapons of the rack could be used, not that only weapons at the C grade could be used. Though the difference was minor in a large sense, Lionel couldn't complain about it. Oh, I guess since these are the rules I should go up now. Lionel stood and inadvertently yawned again. Toward this, he could only shake his head helplessly. He was truly too tired. It wasn't like he was doing it on purpose. Violet Rain's expression darkened. This boy should be very clear that she was targeting him now, yet he actually dared to be so carefree. First battle. 8th seed Indomitable versus 7th seed Seer. She said stiffly. Lionel made it to the stage first, only to find a young man walking toward him. He had a scrawny build and a singular closed eye was painted on the forehead of his mask. In his hand, Seer held an odd short staff with a bulbous head. Compared to the gazes of raging hatred Lionel had gotten used to seeing, Seer's eyes were calm and tranquil. His brows only barely furrowed when he saw that Lionel not only yawned, but also wasn't holding a weapon. Begin. Chapter 135. We'll be back to double chapter uploads tomorrow. Thank you for the birthday wishes, love. Also, I should say that we'll likely be going back to the bonus chapter system in September once school comes back around for me. I'll let you all know. Seer raised his staff toward Lionel the moment the words fell. An arrow of peculiar energy quickly formed, dashing toward Lionel at a much faster speed than most could muster. In that instant of time, even with his spirit severely drained and his ability being sluggish as a result, it was as easy as breathing for Lionel to see that this attack had an agility of just over 1.00. It was quite swift, all things considered. But not enough for Lionel to take it seriously. I guess he'll just push him off the edge of the arena, Lionel thought. Since he had paid attention this time around, he was well aware that there were 3 methods of victory. He could choose between knocking his opponent out and rendering them unable to battle, forcing them to admit defeat, or pushing them outside the bounds of the arena. Either one was fine. Lionel didn't have a particular preference. What's really interesting though is that abilities don't seem to be limited by force-disrupting towers, nor are special branches of force. I didn't think about this before, but my internal sight relies on my spirit, which is technically a kind of force, yet I used it to escape the fort. I actually overlooked something so simple. Lionel's mind wandered. He usually wasn't this type of person. He always took every task, no matter how simple, with the utmost seriousness. However, the problem this time was that his mind was too sluggish. He was almost in a drunken state. Though Lionel was only like this because he didn't sense much of a threat from Seer, others seemed to take this as him being frozen in place due to fear. Not only did others not find this to be pitiable, they even took amusement in it. They seemed to already see the sight of Lionel being blasted off the arena under a chorus of laughs. However, in the last moment, Lionel seemed to remember where he was and shifted to the side. To an outside observer, it almost looked like he stumbled out of the way, allowing the arrow to just barely whiz by him. The sudden movement caused Lionel's mind to spin. He really didn't expect that he would be in such a sorry state just because he stayed awake for a few days. His eyes blinked and he shook his head, trying to clear his vision. A nap would be really nice about now, Lionel thought to himself. Lionel didn't have to raise his eyes to sense that another arrow was coming his way. But this time he took a step long before it reached him. His action seemed without cause, but he had already dodged long before the arrow left Seer's staff. Step after step, Lionel meandered his way through the battlefield. His gait was weak and without rhyme or reason, but seemed to dodge Seer's strikes without much issue. From the outside, he looked like a drunk man stumbling forward, though it wasn't so exaggerated. Seer kept trying to make distance between them, doing his best to continue his barrage. But he was very obviously losing his composure. At some unknown point, the jeers of the crowd shouting out that Lionel was fearful had slowly died down, weird expressions coating their faces one after another. By the time Lionel had made it within a step of Seer, the latter didn't even notice that he had continuously retreated to the edge of the arena. Just when he wanted to take another step back, he found nothing but air, causing him to tumble backward with a shocked expression on his face. He knew that this should have been impossible. He wasn't a fool, he too had heard the rules, so he knew stepping out of bounds meant a loss. But he could have never expected that he would somehow still make such a stupid mistake. He thought that he had been circling the arena, maintaining a good distance from Lionel. So when did he get forced into a corner like this? When Seer looked up, all he found was that Lionel was actually yawning again, causing his face behind the mask to blush with shame, embarrassment and rage. Lionel squinted his eyes and shook his head as though trying to chase his fatigue away. He hadn't even noticed the change in the Seer's once calm eyes. By the time his vision cleared again, he saw that a young woman was helping Seer up and glaring toward him with fierce eyes. Though Lionel couldn't see her face, he was quite certain that her angry appearance was quite adorable. Her eyes alone were enough to tell him this. She, as a participant, of course wore a mask. The design on hers was quite involved compared to others. The center of her forehead had the drawing of a seed, and from there, a cycle of growth was drawn around her round face. Eventually, a flower bloomed before the cycle ended with another seed. Lionel had seen her amongst the 8 seeds of the second round, and judging by the pseudonyms, he guessed that she could be either Falling Leaf or Precious Moment. More likely the latter, as there was someone else with a mask that more conformed to the former. At that moment, the crowd that had fallen silent suddenly erupted once more. The chorus of boos was deafening. Disqualify him. Get him out of here. When did such a bastard appear amongst our promising youths? It could only be said that the rebels truly were infuriated this time. It was one thing for Lionel to defeat his opponent. But his act of looking down from the stage and even yawning after Seer had already lost was simply too much. You could defeat a man, but humiliating him was going one step too far. How could they know that Lionel was only yawning because he was truly tired? As for looking down on Seer, that had a similar reason as well. He didn't want to waste energy by making unnecessary movements, so he stood in place until the next match began. After all, he would be fighting again. Unfortunately for the crowd, the Lionel of now already had turned a deaf ear to their reactions. He couldn't even hear them any longer. His world was filled with silence. Indomitable wins. Next match, Indomitable versus Precious Moment. At that moment, the young girl who had helped Seer stand furiously marched onto the stage, her little body billowing with rage. Lionel shuffled from the edge of the arena, his feet barely lifting up from the ground as he turned to face her. Chapter 136. Lionel really didn't have the mind to think about why yet another person was angry toward him. His half-closed eyes sized up the petite little girl. Truthfully, he didn't have much of a reaction toward women who weren't his Aina. It could even be said that his personality around Aina was skewed as a result of this. Usually he was rather detached from most things, even if he had an amiable smile on. Seeing this petite girl before him, others might have had thoughts of going easy on her. But Lionel didn't spare such a thoughts toward this at all. Rather, just like with his last opponent, he was thinking of how to defeat this woman as easily and quickly as possible. Go on, Precious Moment, teach him a lesson. Show the bastard what a real promising youth looks like. Violet Rain watched all of this from the overseer's box, a gloomy expression on her face. She found that there was most definitely something wrong with Lionel's battle with Seer. However, all thoughts she had of analyzing the battle flew away when she saw Lionel yawn. At this point, even the male commanders by her side couldn't help but frown. They too believed that Lionel had gone too far. Old Hutch laughed uproariously when he saw this scene. Since Lionel had been in his home the whole time, he of course knew why Lionel was constantly yawning. The reason he had been able to get Lionel's recording in the first place was because his home was covered in cameras and various security devices, so he was aware that Lionel had stood in the same place without moving for a whole 5 days. He had to say he admired the dedication of the boy even if he was certain that it wouldn't bear any fruit. That said, he had no intention of explaining this to these people. What could he say? He was an old man who liked watching the world burn. Who else was going to entertain him in his old age if not this boy? Earth had entered a calm before the storm. Old Hutch didn't feel like waiting for things to get interesting again, so why not make his own entertainment? Begin. The moment Violet Rain's displeased voice filled the arena once more, Precious Moment moved, her small body charging toward Lionel with a full head of steam. She wants to fight me bare-handed? Is it related to her ability? Lionel frowned slightly. After the shock he went through with Aina, he no longer dared to assume the strength of a person by their size. The issue was that he could clearly see that Precious Moment's strength stat wasn't even half of his own. Yet she was still charging toward him like this. At this point, Lionel felt a little regretful that he hadn't been paying attention to the previous battles, or else he wouldn't be guessing like this. However, in the end he threw these worries to the back of his mind. This wasn't really a matter of choice as the little girl was already right before him. Lionel caught a twitch in Precious Moment's shoulder and immediately calculated the trajectory of her punch before she even threw it. I'm not far from the edge of the arena, I can probably just push her right off by using her momentum against her. However, Lionel could have never expected that Precious Moment's initial punch was actually a feint. Just as he moved out of its trajectory, her arm stopped halfway along its path and pulled back against her body before another fist was sent toward him. A fierce glint could be seen in Precious Moment's eyes. The sight of Lionel's loss was practically guaranteed to her at this very moment. She chose the name Precious Moment for a very specific reason. Her ability could be considered a sensory type as well, evolving similarly to Lionel's. She could read the cause and effect of events to predict what would happen next. Of course, the scope of her ability was extremely limited, but was absolutely perfect in a one-on-one battle like this one. She had already predicted what would happen next. She saw through the fact that Lionel seemed to be able to see through the trajectory of her attack. He would then try to wrap around her and push her off the stage. Knowing this, she threw a feint, then immediately followed up with a second punch aimed exactly where Lionel was dodging. With him being off balance like this, her victory was practically guaranteed. She might not be as strong as someone with an offensive ability, but she was still far stronger than a normal human. This was all Lionel thought when he saw Precious Moment's feint and follow-up attack. Ultimately, his battle experience was still a little bit green. He wasn't yet able to easily distinguish between a real attack and a feint. He was mostly able to rely on his ability to always react quickly. That said, Precious Moment was still underestimating him a bit too much. Her ability only worked when her enemy was within a certain physical limit. If they were beyond this, it simply didn't matter how much she could predict if she was unable to react. Lionel's dodging body suddenly grew a step faster, sliding out of the way of Precious Moment's second fist. In one swift motion he wrapped around her back, pushing a foot out and knocking her off the platform. Even as she fell from the arena, Precious Moment couldn't help but be stunned. She was bound to not be the last. Under the continuously growing ugly expressions of those within the crowd, and Violet Rain especially, Lionel seemed to stumble his way through victory after victory, taking down Falling Leaf and Erupting Volcano in quick succession. And even when Roaring Black Lion stepped onto the stage before him, his yawns had still never stopped. Old Hutch's laughter seemed to grow more and more unbridled. It was as though he was afraid others wouldn't hear him and forget their fury. Violet Rain ground her teeth, looking down toward the arena with a reddened gaze. It's fine, she thought to herself, taking deep breaths. Roaring Black Lion was among the only 3 to defeat the 5 invalids, albeit slower than Thunderous Clap and Chasing Wind. Defeating Indomitable shouldn't be a problem. A sinking feeling took hold the pit of her stomach. If her own rule change allowed Lionel to use all 7 of these geniuses as stepping stones, it would be too infuriating. Chapter 137. You're really good at pissing everyone off. These were the first words Roaring Black Lion spoke. He stood tall with his arms crossed over his broad chest. Lionel smiled bitterly. Would you believe me if I said it wasn't on purpose? Roaring Black Lion looked him up and down as though trying to decide whether or not Lionel was telling the truth. When he had spoken to Lionel previously, he hadn't gotten the vibe that he was an arrogant man. In fact, back then he had half expected Lionel to sneer at his words from back then and tell him to screw off. He had been hoping for that result so that he would have an excuse to teach him a lesson, but things didn't end up working out like that. After that, he felt that Lionel kept giving him a weird feeling. It was an odd gravity that made others want to pay attention to him, and this pull was even stronger than Thunderous Clap, who was a well-known leader amongst the promising youths. However, that feeling was completely contradictory to the hatred Lionel was garnering. Would a leader who could surpass even Thunderous Clap in charisma be so hated? Another person might have thrown this thought to the back of their minds as soon as they had it. But Roaring Black Lion was a man who relied heavily on his instinct. This became even more so after awakening his ability. Not only did he smell the faint scent of death on Lionel, he could even tell that many of the things that happened today weren't exactly as they seemed. Suddenly, Roaring Black Lion began to laugh as the crowd booed toward Lionel's response. How could they believe that all of this had been a coincidence? Since they couldn't turn their rage to hutch, who else could face their anger if not Lionel? They felt stifled watching Lionel win battle after battle. Now they were pinning all of their hopes on Roaring Black Lion's shoulders. I want to see your strength. The roar of the promising youth's voice was several times louder than Thunderous Clap's. In that moment, his body began to expand, the clothing on him expanding along with him as though it was specially designed for this moment. Black fur erupted across his body as his hair sprouted, becoming a mane that pushed against his mask. His mask was removed by him. What was left wasn't the face of a human, but rather a fiendish lion with eyes deeper than a black abyss. Roaring Black Lion had grown to almost 2.5 meters tall. He still stood on 2 legs and seemed to be a humanoid beast of sorts, but the power in his limbs put any full beast to shame. There it is. Roaring Black Lion's transformation. The crowd was seething with excitement. Roaring Black Lion hadn't used his ability during the first round, so this was the first time they had seen it today. How could they not be excited? It was said that he was twice as powerful in this state. Lionel's eyes narrowed slightly seeing such a scene. Roaring Black Lion, Strength, 2. 71, Speed, 2. 12, Agility, 1. 97, Coordination, 1. 92, Stamina, 2. 83, Reactions, 2. 73, Spirit, 0. 03, Force. The crowd completely regained their liveliness when Roaring Black Lion brandished his claws. He raised his head into the skies and billowed with all his might. Roar! The arena quaked. In that moment, the roar drowned out even the crowd themselves. That wasn't a simple roar. Lionel's frown deepened. He felt that his blood and his muscles cramped upon hearing that roar. It actually had the effect of demoralizing him and weakening his strength. All of this suddenly made sense. Roaring Black Lion likely had an ability with great evolution potential. A normal strength-enhancing ability wouldn't allow him to rank amongst the top promising youths even though the strength boost from his transformation was so obscene. Lionel regained his calm. Taking a step to the side, he calmly walked to the edge of the arena. Is he going to quit? There wasn't just one person in the crowd who believed this. Even Violet Rain's gloomy expression loosened up a bit as she sighed a breath of relief. Unfortunately for her though, this feeling didn't last for long. Lionel walked to the weapon rack and scanned it for a moment before pulling out a plain black rod. It wasn't that he didn't want to take a spear, but if he did and the ring on his finger didn't acknowledge it, it would crumble to dust. So using a rod was his only choice. Plus, he had a good impression of Roaring Black Lion. At the very least, he was far more pleasing to the eye compared to the others that were here. In that case, he had no intention of harming him. A rod? Isn't that Thunderous Clap's weapon of choice? Indomitable uses a rod as well? Lionel sluggishly yawned once more, walking back to face the beast that now stood over 1/2 meter taller than him. He stopped 10 meters from Roaring Black Lion, his eyes tired but tranquil. Silence fell over the arena for a moment. Begin. Roaring Black Lion lashed out immediately, not pausing even for a moment. His claws left streaks in the air. If it wasn't for the ban on killing, they would have been fully extended. However, for the sake of the rules, he attacked with his palm. Yet even with this being the case, his silvery claws twinkled beneath the arena lights, contrasting his ferocious appearance with something quite dazzling and beautiful. Lionel didn't move at all. A palm almost as large as his chest descended toward his tired figure. It seemed for a moment that there would be no suspense to the battle at all. It was even to the point where Roaring Black Lion's massive figure seemed to enshroud him completely. Just when it seemed Lionel would be sent flying, he suddenly moved. No one could tell what happened. In one moment, Lionel was standing in place. In the next, a blinding light had covered him from head to toe. He seemed to vanish in place, and by the time he could be seen by the crowd once again, The butt of his rod had landed on roaring black lion's broad chest. Bang! The loose fabric of Lionel's sweatpants fluttered wildly beneath the air pressure of his own speed as roaring black lion was sent flying. Almost like a streaking meteor, he left a black arc in the air, crashing outside the arena and skidding along the ground in a sorry state. Silence. At that moment, old Hutch, who had been leisurely enjoying his pizza, stood up violently, leaping to the windows of the overseer's box as though he couldn't believe what he had just seen. Lionel calmly picked up the mask roaring black lion had tossed aside, throwing it toward his collapsed figure just as the latter's ability dissolved. The mask left a trail in the air, landing just well enough to cover the youth's face. However, Lionel no longer cared about this. His head had already turned toward the place where Thunderous Clap sat. "Hurry up." These were the only 2 words he spoke. His fatigue seemed to vanish, the flickering lights that danced across his body growing more intense with each passing moment. Chapter 138, Off. Silence. No, that wasn't entirely correct. There was indeed one sound remaining in the now quiet arena. On first inspection it was a bit like breathing that hitched every so often. However, after a moment, it became clear that it was light snoring. Someone was actually sleeping. In fact, all of the people in the arena couldn't help but look between this sleeping young man and his recently decimated opponent. On the ground, laying right beside roaring black lion, Thunderous Clap lay weakly, coughing up several mouthfuls of blood. As for the culprit who put him in this state, he was sleeping like a baby without a scratch on him, having collapsed under his own fatigue. The scenes of what just happened continuously replayed in Thunderous Clap's head. That man told him to hurry up and get onto the arena. As he had his own pride, he obviously obliged, believing that, even after watching the fashion in which roaring black lion lost, he could still win. However, all he saw was a flash of gold. Then he felt a sharp pain on his chest. And before he realized what happened, he was lying on his back, nursing several shattered ribs. In the overseer's box, Violet Rain's expression was solemn. One would expect her to be enraged, but this wasn't the emotion she had at this moment now at all. All she felt was astonishment. But her astonishment couldn't match up to Hutch's at all. This was because while everyone was shocked that Lionel managed to defeat roaring black lion and Thunderous Clap, both in a single blow, he was shocked due to that radiant energy that was coming from him. There was something about that energy that was extremely similar to his blade force, but it wasn't exactly like that either. It was somehow different but the same at once. He didn't need to think more about it to understand. Lionel had comprehended a force-strengthening deviation. But it wasn't spear force. It was something else entirely, something that even seemed somewhat more formidable. In the stands, Damien, the lady he called Vixen, and the others were also shocked. They had been here from the very beginning, but they had remained silent the whole time. They were among the few who knew that Indomitable was Lionel. But did they dare to step out and defend him? Not to mention the fact the commentary of the crowd had been fairly benign. If they really did step up to defend Lionel, they'd probably get beaten black and blue. Damien had been aware of how great Lionel's strength was. Those youths up there would give even him a hard battle, and he was a lieutenant. But didn't Lionel defeat him just the same? The reason he was shocked wasn't because Lionel defeated them. It was because he had done so with just a single strike. Didn't that mean that Lionel could defeat him with a single strike too? So many eyes had landed upon Lionel, yet he continued to sleep without a care in the world. It was as though the hard arena ground had become the softest of beds. What a brat. Hutch sighed and made his way down to the arena. Before the eyes of everyone, he reached down, grabbed Lionel, and swung him over his shoulder as though he was carrying a sack of potatoes. If Lionel was awake, he might have had the presence of mind to get angry about this, but he was clearly in a state where he could sleep in just about any condition. Thunderous Clap's gaze of shame and anger landed on Lionel. But even if the latter was awake and willing to fight him again, he could hardly move an inch. Just breathing racked his body with pain far more severe than anything he had ever experienced before. Thinking back to those words he spoke to Lionel, a deep sense of humiliation welled up in his heart. It honestly wasn't his fault that things reached this point. Anyone who saw Lionel's actions without understanding the backstory behind them would think him to be an arrogant bastard. Thunderous Clap had always been a straightforward and by-the-books kind of person, so he wanted to teach Lionel a lesson. He just never imagined that this would actually backfire. The truth was that Lionel had already been reaching his limit after so many battles. He didn't tell Thunderous Clap to hurry up and get on the stage because he was arrogant, but rather because he only had the strength left for one more strike. Lionel couldn't be said to be a confrontational person, but Thunderous Clap's previous words had touched his bottom line. He refused to settle down until he could return the latter's words back to him. After the deed was done, Lionel directly fell asleep. Due to this, everyone knew that Chasing Wind would be named first among the promising youths, but there was no one who congratulated her. They were all aware that the young man who had truly earned the first place was the one they were all watching snore right this very moment. Her expression couldn't help but flicker several times as she watched Hutch haul Lionel away. Just what was that attack he used? Was that related to his ability? How could he be faster than her? These were all the thoughts that swirled around in her mind, and it left her stifled to the point she wanted to shout into the skies. In the minds of the rebels who didn't know Lionel's true character, the villain had won today. Indomitable had stamped down on their pride, all while yawning the whole way. Then, when he saw they really couldn't relieve his boredom, he directly fell asleep. He completely disregarded them. He didn't care for their emotions, their rage, their heartache. Like an evil mastermind, he played with their emotions and left them in a puddle of their own tears. When Lionel had disappeared off into the distance, Thunderous Clap could no longer hold on and directly passed out beside Roaring Black Lion. This legend was bound to spread throughout the Slayer Legion, maybe even to the point it would reach the ears of the Empire. Chapter 139. Lionel awoke with a stretch. It felt so good that he held the pose for several moments, unwilling to leave that satisfying feeling behind. He sat up with a smile. He was oddly happy at this moment. A burden that had been weighing on his heart felt as though it had been lifted. Plus, after finally getting some sleep, he felt refreshed and his spirit was even stronger than it had been just a few days ago. Even though he was an asshole, I have to admit that this Thunderous Clap person did indeed help me. If it wasn't for him, who knew how long I would have taken to come to such a realization? You're awake. Lionel was so startled by the sudden voice that he practically jumped out of bed. He hadn't even noticed that the door had opened just now to reveal a very familiar and very annoying old man. Old Hutch shook his head, his face filled with disdain. How could you possibly sleep like this on a battlefield? I could have slit your throat 100 different ways. Lionel's lip twitched. He had lived in a Mayan tomb and faced thousands of Spaniards alone in that time. If there was anyone who knew how to sleep while being alert, it was him. But was there a need for that right now? Since you're awake now, don't you think you owe me an explanation? Lionel didn't know what the old man meant by this. You were so confident in getting first place, yet didn't you only get second? You practically threw my face out there. How can I show myself in public anymore? Hearing this, Lionel almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. He may have been second, but did Chasing Wind really dare to claim first? As far as he was concerned, who was the superior among them all was obvious. But he had simply been too tired. After teaching Thunderous Clap a lesson for the words he spoke, Lionel couldn't be bothered to enter the final round. Old Hutch could obviously see through Lionel's expression, but he didn't seem to want to let up. I don't care what reasons you have. I was promised a first-place finish, yet I didn't get it. So, I'll be taking something in exchange. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What the hell did this old man want now? That light you used to defeat that brat Thunderous Clap and that other brat Roaring Black Lion. What was it? Oh. Lionel understood what was going on now. This old man just wanted to ask him this question without losing face. So he made it seem like Lionel owed him an explanation. Lionel could only say that old Hutch was indeed shameless enough. In the end, Lionel shrugged. I was studying my lineage factor and happened upon another one. I felt a very strong connection to it, so I coaxed it out. The result should probably be some element-based force-strengthening deviation. Lionel casually explained, but the words alone caused ripples to go off in old Hutch's heart. Had I not been distracted, I would have comprehended spear force already. Lionel mumbled. The truth was that he had been comprehending spear force, but this lineage factor intrigued him, mostly because it most definitely wasn't like the metal synergy lineage factor his father described. That likely meant there was a third lineage factor in his blood. It could only be said that there simply wasn't enough time between Lionel's epiphany and the gathering, or else he would have been even more monstrous. After setting himself on the path of logically deducing his own talent and lineage factors, a whole new door had been opened to him. The bad news about this path was that he would progress slower than his lineage factor would otherwise allow him to. Theoretically, that is. Relying on instinct and talent is usually much faster. This was just the way of life. However, Lionel had a certain advantage those who were lacking in talent did not have. His ability. Lionel's analytical ability was far beyond most. As a result, his progress was actually faster than it would otherwise be by relying on talent and intuition. This not only meant that Lionel could forcefully awaken his lineage factors himself as long as he grasped a small inkling of them, it also meant that he was no longer restricted by the so-called awakening phase of the lineage factor either. According to Aina, the longer one maintained consciousness after awakening their lineage factor, the stronger it would be. However, for Lionel, who was slowly comprehending his lineage factor himself, it didn't matter if he stayed awake for a single second or several days. Eventually he would unveil all the hidden mysteries of his lineage factor. At most, if he didn't stay awake for long enough, it would be slightly more difficult than it would otherwise be. That said, hadn't Lionel just stayed awake for 5 days? That was even longer than he had when he awakened his spear domain lineage factor. Like this, the bad of his path was essentially expunged as long as his ability continued to evolve. With this, the good was nearly endless. Aside from thanking Thunderous Clap, Lionel really had to thank Hutch as well. Or else who knows if he would have ever stumbled on this path at all. So that light really was a force-strengthening deviation? Old Hutch finally responded after a while. Hearing Lionel say that he could have comprehended Spear Force already by now made him want to give the brat a smack, but he refrained since he wanted to know more. Yes, Lionel said slowly. I still know very little about it. All I've unveiled is that it can increase my speed by a large margin. I still have to study it more. There were many things Lionel left out. For example, he was certain that if this lineage factor wasn't from his father, then it must be from his mother. In addition, he hadn't only unveiled that the force-strengthening deviation he had learned through his lineage factor could boost his speed, but he also knew that it had terrifying piercing power. Had he used this latter ability, he would have directly killed his opponents with ease even if he only used a rod. But Lionel still wasn't at the point of divulging his everything to Hutch even if he was grateful to the old man. What Lionel and even old Hutch didn't know was that what Lionel had grasped was light elemental force. Old Hutch might have known what this was, but Lionel's explanation was simply too vague and purposely omitted many points. If others knew that Lionel had comprehended such a thing, the shock would be immeasurable. Even among force-strengthening deviations, light elemental force was among the strongest. Its versatility was near inexhaustible and its strength was undeniable. However, even with this being said, the real reason it would arise shock was because it was simply too rare. Amongst several worlds, there might only be 2 or 3 people to grasp such a thing. And families with lineage factors related to it were even rarer. It was no wonder Lionel instinctually set aside comprehending Spear Force in favor of it. Compared to Spear Force, light elemental force was beyond by an impossible degree. Chapter 140. Is this why you came here, old Hutch? In truth, Lionel was more interested in this old man leaving him alone. Not only did he want to comprehend Spear Force, but he also had many other things to do. He really hoped that Damien hadn't left by now, or else he had no idea how he would get back to Royal Blue Province. Not exactly, old Hutch said after a moment. There's a hunt that was planned to take place for the first time this year. It's a great training ground for you little brats. Not interested, Lionel responded without hesitation. What a joke, he had already wasted so much time here. Every day he spent on Earth was another day that passed in terrain. In fact, for all he knew, time was dilated across worlds as well, just like they were in zones. He had no way of knowing until he went there. He had no idea why Hutch was trying to get him to participate in these meaningless activities, but he truly was not interested. Even before he comprehended light elemental force, it was unlikely that anyone in his age group could defeat him. But now it was even more exaggerated. He simply saw no merit in it. At this point, Lionel understood that his advantage was simply too vast. His father was likely from a higher dimensional world, so his body had more talent than those born in a third-grade dimension like this one. It couldn't be helped. Of course, there were those like Aina who seemed to match up to him due to their mysterious families. But this was even more reason for Lionel to not care about the Slayer Legion. The fact the 4th-rank youth of their southern lookout could be defeated in a single strike by him likely meant that the Slayer Legion likely had no such families, and as a result, didn't have a bright future. Lionel still remembered Aina's words. Success in the future could track back and influence the past. Though it was difficult for him to wrap his mind around, he only needed to understand that this was a fact. Since the Slayer Legion didn't have such special families, it only meant that their future was equally not as special. That said, Lionel wasn't very optimistic that those youths from families like the Brazingers were a match for him either. Don't be so quick to dismiss this opportunity, Hutch said without a care. This hunt won't be as simple as you think it is. Is that so? Hutch nodded confidently. But, seeing that Lionel was still skeptical, he decided to explain a bit. It was obvious to him now that Lionel would be a future pillar of Earth, so he should be privy to a few things that others weren't. Since you even know about force strengthening deviation, you probably know already that many were aware that this metamorphosis was coming before it truly descended. Lionel's expression darkened a bit at these words. Of course he had already guessed this. How many billions had died falling from Paradise Islands due to the higher-ups keeping this information to themselves? It seemed now that even the Slayer Legion was aware of this ahead of time, something that made Lionel even more disappointed in them than he already was. Was this really a so-called rebellion of the people? Why was it that this Slayer Legion never seemed to act as a grassroots movement should? Hutch sighed upon seeing Lionel's gloomy expression. Things aren't always as simple as they seem on the surface, brat. If we made a move to try and save everybody, Earth's population would have likely been wiped out by now. Lionel frowned upon hearing this. The likelihood of successfully awakening your ability is too low. It's even lower if you come from a poor background. Lionel clenched his jaw. He understood this well. The weaker your background, the less likely you were to succeed in the future, and as such, you couldn't affect change in the current timeline that would then, in turn, help your future path. These people were the least likely to awaken their abilities. It was a difficult chicken and the egg situation. If we tried to save everyone, Earth would have been overrun by invalids. Even though invalids also provide opportunities to improve upon killing them, they are incredibly dangerous as well. They don't need to rest, eat, or sleep. These are things you probably already know, but what you don't know is that when the concentration of invalids is high and that of humans is low, variants that consume other invalids can appear in high concentrations. When this happens, the invalids that awaken their intelligence once again appear in droves. Isn't that a good thing? Lionel asked. No, it's the worst thing. Invalids who awaken their intelligence are no longer humans. They're variant invalids who still live to devour us. The only difference is that they're smarter in their approach. In addition, they all have the ingrained ability to control other invalids. Don't think for a moment that they'll go back to the person they once were after they awaken. Variant invalids are far stronger than us. As the saying goes, the harder something is, the more rewarding it is as well. The path variant invalids have to go through to truly awaken is far more arduous than us, and as such, the benefits are far greater as well. Old Hutch could tell that Lionel still wasn't convinced by all of this. The kid didn't believe sacrificing the lives of so many just because of a potential calamity was worth it. These were still people. They weren't betting stakes one could choose not to take the risk on. The old man could only sigh once more. Kid, there are too many eyes on Earth. The potential of our world is the greatest to be birthed in a very long while. There's no end to the greedy eyes that see us as a feast to take part in. If we are stuck in this prepubescent stage for too long, taking too much time to clear our world and form up our centers of power again, then, when we lose the current thin veil of protection we have, we'll be screwed. Lionel remained quiet. Even if he understood, he didn't like it at all. What is this hunt you were talking about? Chapter 141. After a while, the old man left, leaving Lionel to his thoughts. It's interesting, I guess. Lionel didn't expect to be interested in this hunt. But in the end, the old man had actually managed to convince him. Plus, it would apparently not interfere with his schedule to go back, as Damien and the others would still be stuck here for a while longer. According to the old man, the hunt had been being planned not just a few years, but decades even. It might not even be an exaggeration to say more than a century, in fact. Project Hunt could be considered to be one of Earth's contingency plans. If Hutch's words were to be believed, it was likely that a similar practice was taken on by the Empire as well. This so-called Project Hunt was an attempt to raise evolved beasts. As Lionel had so unfortunately found out already, humans weren't the only ones who could awaken. The project itself spent years diligently breeding and cross-breeding different species of animals to create incredibly powerful creatures. The hope was that upon the descent of the metamorphosis, these creatures would awaken miraculous abilities that would allow humans to benefit. These beasts would become great natural resources. Their meat would be the best tonic for human warriors, allowing them to progress at much faster speeds. Also, according to Hutch, beasts have much larger ethereal glabellas upon awakening. This is not only due to their larger size in general, but it can also be considered an evolutionary buffer to their intelligence. After all, beasts are innately inferior in this aspect. Those who successfully awaken are thus compensated in this way. The larger ethereal glabellas of beasts are considered to be delicacies that can even improve the speed of evolution of one's ability. They're called beast crystals. Thinking back to the octopus stored in the segmented cube, Lionel suddenly understood why it was that the latter had wanted the former so badly. After all of this, Lionel was even more impressed with exactly where these projects took place. When he asked Old Hutch about that, the old man hadn't held back. Apparently, Project Hunt took advantage of the fact that Earth only had one supercontinent and spread the project across several offland islands. Each of these islands had their own unique environment, pushing the evolution of beasts in certain aspects. Now, after so much preparation, it was finally time to reap the rewards of their labor of over 100 years. Lionel wasn't interested in the beasts for the potential boost to his ability. Since his ability had already broke into the realms of the fifth dimension, he doubted that there were any beasts on Earth that could help him improve any further. But Old Hutch had let it slip that the closer Earth approached to the end of the metamorphosis, the more striking changes would take place. Soon there would be force crystals forming and these islands could be ideal hotspots. After all, even if one appeared in the city on the mainland, it wasn't as though Lionel could dig through the layers of dense stone and metals to reach them. These places would be perfect toward helping him fill his segmented cube to the brim to pave a path for his later breakthroughs. Even this, though, wasn't the main reason Lionel's interest had been piqued. After so long, Lionel was finally ready to create his first force craft. In fact, he had already settled on two designs. One was a weapon and the other was an upgrade to a treasure he already had. The second design, the upgrade, was related to his treasure shoes. However, the main point was that the main design around the upgrade was reliant on the suction cups of the octopus. By now, his purpose might have been obvious. He wanted to see just what other evolved beasts existed. If there were any that were particularly useful, he might be able to design more useful upgrades. Lionel took a deep breath and finally stood from his bed. A moment later, he had already entered the lab setting of the segmented cube's Phase 1. Hey little Tali. After completing Lesson 3 and learning everything there was to know about the relationship between familiars and their force crafters, Lionel named the little metal spirit Tolliver, a name the little guy seemed to like quite a lot. Lionel smiled lightly, slipping on his protective gloves and allowing the little metal spirit to excitedly snake across his fingers. For a moment, man and spirit seemed to become one. Lionel's fingers danced and Tali's body seemed to respond instantaneously, changing its movements along with Lionel's will. A long while later, Lionel finished playing with Tolliver and placed the little guy on the table, turning a serious eye toward the several large pieces of paper laid out before him. After Lionel learned everything there was to learn about Lesson 3, the next touched on force art, and the lesson after that was titled Functional Design. This lesson not only taught him basic concepts of design, but most importantly taught him about drawing blueprints. Lionel had never taken an art class before, nor was he familiar with calligraphy. After all, this was the 25th century, nobody writes anymore. So the first few attempts he made were abysmal. But over time, with how high his coordination stat was, not only did he improve by leaps and bounds, his penmanship could even be said to be quite beautiful. Calligraphy on Earth referred to the writing of characters. In ancient Eastern countries, this was especially important to their culture. However, the West had quite a few practitioners as well. To force crafters, calligraphy referred to the art of drawing force arts. Each branch of force art was a unique language with its own unique quirks. A steady hand and a keen eye was, of course, important for all of this. Thankfully, Lionel's basics were exceptionally robust. Due to the force art he had drawn on the back of his palm, his knowledge of third-dimensional force arts was incredible. So, when he moved on to fourth-dimensional force arts as he was now, the result was him improving at unimaginable speeds. The blueprints before Lionel now were the product of several hours of work. But he still felt like something was missing. It was an intuition that kept nagging at him. He knew that if he designed his first weapon based on these designs, it would fail. At that moment, Lionel suddenly slapped his forehead. Idiot. Why waste time drawing all of these blueprints in real life when you have your dream world? Lionel closed his eyes and sunk into a state of meditation. A moment later, he found himself in a wide blank space, but there was a bright smile on his face. A quill identical to the one Montez gave him manifested in his hand. This was the product of a dream sculpt he forged. Then he began to draw in the air. The scene was absolutely dazzling. The sight of several layers of blueprints being built atop of each other with glistening transparent lines made it almost feel as though Lionel was playing God. Chapter 142. It was as though a whole new world had opened up to Lionel. Even someone with an ability as analytical as himself had been having issues with the blueprinting process. It wasn't that his mind didn't have enough computational ability, but rather that he simply didn't have enough experience. Since this was his first creation, it was only made of 3 parts. Yet, the process of transferring those ideas to their individual blueprints, then visualizing the 2D and 3D while ensuring that all the parameters are within appropriate margins of error was difficult for a newbie like Lionel. Imagine for a moment that you had to design a screw and the hole it would screw into. From the outside, this seems incredibly simple. However, this isn't the case at all. The grooves of a screw that allow it to solidly embed itself into the appropriate hole could be measured in millimeters. If the hole is a fraction too big and the screw is a fraction too small, suddenly the error compounds and you have a useless screw on your hands. This was the absolute simplest example. What if the parts are more complex than this? What if there's more than just 2 parts to consider? Lionel was dealing with 3 parts currently, but he already had a headache. Ensuring that machine parts work smoothly as one even when they were manufactured separately was probably the bane of all engineers. But now, Lionel felt that he had solved this problem that plagued all beginner force crafters. In the blink of an eye, Lionel had drawn out the blueprints for all 3 of his parts and laid them flat in the air. Though his arm moved as though he was really drawing, this was his dream world. Was there even a need to actually do so? At most, this was a little fanfare. So it's like this. Lionel's eyes shone brightly, internally kicking himself for not realizing he could use his dream world in this way. If he entered his dream world, then used Dream Sculpt to build up the individual parts of his creations, it was possible to test everything before he even began. Not only this, but he could check the feasibility of his designs without causing irreparable changes to the materials he was handling. Lionel pinched his fingers toward one of his blueprints and pulled them apart, causing the design to expand. Before Lionel's eye, what once was a flat drawing gained form. In a flash, the other 2 pieces followed suit, then, along with the closing of Lionel's hands, they came together and formed a complete treasure. If someone else was here, they would immediately recognize it as a handgun, albeit a uniquely shaped one. The nozzle was incredibly long and narrow for a gun of its kind. It was just over a foot in length but barely 1.5 centimeters in width. Its handle was thick and ergonomic. If Lionel were to reach out and grasp it, it would perfectly form to his hand. However, if one looked closely, it was possible to see many small holes spread all across its surface. This was the true secret of this gun. It could work with bullets, but the main reason Lionel created it was thanks to its ability to function even without bullets. That was right, Lionel designed this gun to work similarly to the invisible attacks of the Mayan priest or the arrow of Seer's staff. All he had to do was pour his force into it and it would form and shoot the projectile for him. As for how this projectile would compare to Seer or the Mayan priest, Lionel was certain that its speed and piercing power would be more than double. However, those were calculations he had made before he awakened his light elemental force. If he used light elemental force instead of normal force, the effect would definitely be even more exaggerated. The trouble was whether or not his design could take it and whether the force arts he chose to pair with this treasure would be enough. Lionel exploded the size of his design again and narrowed his eyes, allowing the hovering design to spin slowly before him. He wanted to grasp every single little detail. The design I settled on is very simple. The nozzle, the hollow grip, and the weight. When I pour force into the gun, the weight within the handle is pushed up. The moment the energy is released, the weight will shoot back down to its original position. Depending on how much force I use, the rebound can be either stronger or weaker. Thanks to this, the recoil mitigation can be properly scaled depending on the situation. Compared to the anti-recoil technology of the Empire's best guns, Lionel's could be considered to be rudimentary to the extreme. In fact, he knew there were many problems with it. For one, the current design only accounted for vertical recoil but not horizontal. Lionel felt that this was an easy fix. If Lionel angled the weight's ascent and descent, he could account for this as well. Lionel mentally made the changes that were needed. And, thanks to his dream world, they immediately manifested in the design before him, causing him to smile beside himself. The next issue is the nozzle. The longer the nozzle, the more time the bullet will have to accelerate, but it also makes it a weak point of the design. Lionel thought about this for a long time. If things remained like this, he didn't believe that the nozzle would last very long. It was too fragile. After a moment, Lionel came to a conclusion. It's impossible to create something perfect. Everything has give and take. Instead of worrying so much over this, I should instead modify the design so that the nozzle is a fail point that can be easily swapped and replaced. When Lionel came to this decision, instead of making the nozzle stronger, he actually purposely made it much weaker. There was no need to invest too many materials into something that was bound to fail. Not only did he make it weaker, but he added many natural breaking points so that repair would be easy and simple. These breakpoints would not only allow the nozzle to fail in predictable ways, but it would also ensure that its failure wouldn't harm Lionel. It would be too great of a joke if Lionel's gun exploded and killed him mid-battle. Lionel planned on making 2 guns and 10 nozzles. This way he could swap the nozzles mid-battle if necessary. When Lionel settled on the final design, he used Dream Sculpt to create perfect memory fragments within his mind. Now he was ready to begin. Chapter 143. Lionel exited his dream world and smiled, taking the little metal spirit into his hands and playing with it again. "This'll be our first project together, Tali. Are you excited?" Tali split into numerous balls of silver, jumping around Lionel's hands like little globules of mercury. The little guy didn't need to speak for Lionel to know that it was excited. Recently, Lionel had been feeding it a lot of metals. Earth might have not been a fourth-dimensional world just yet, and as such, was lacking in high-quality minerals that came with this evolution. But they as a people had squeezed everything they could out of the materials they did have, creating alloys that this little metal spirit loved to eat at its current stage of evolution. Tali's favorite snack was an alloy of platinum and iridium. Using it, the little guy had already reached the 5th black tier. Lionel was very careful not to overfeed Tali though. According to the hazard lesson, doing so could cause overflow. It was a dangerous state spirits could enter where they sought to devour everything. Toward this, Lionel could only shake his head. His father had actually likened the state to a stomach ache. How such a catastrophic event could be as simple as a stomach ache was beyond him. Lionel took a deep breath and went into a state of meditation. This time, however, it wasn't to enter his dream world, but rather to prepare his mind and settle his heart. His father said that the most important thing in a successful crafting was one's state of mind. His oppressive aura unwittingly surged out from him, causing the playful metal spirit to grow silent and solemn. It was easily affected by Lionel's presence, its own will becoming somewhat suppressed. The first step in crafting was exactly this, spirit unity. During the process, Lionel and Tolliver would have to work as one. It was necessary for their thoughts and actions to be one and the same. At that moment, Lionel's dull gaze became bright once more and 2 familiar ores appeared before him. Tolliver separated into 2, coating each one of his palms as he grasped toward the first ore. This unrefined ore was known as black herb oregon. It was part of the herb class of metals. Those of this class were exceptionally good at forming alloys and had strengthening effects on metals they were melded with due to their special chemical structure. Herb ores were a strategical resource no matter which world one was talking about. They were a foundation piece in almost every treasure in existence and were key components in treasures that needed to fuse 2 volatile materials. Black herb ore was considered the lowest grade. However, if it was combined with the high-level metal technology of Earth, it was like giving wings to a tiger. Even compared to other pseudo-fourth-dimensional worlds, Earth was incredibly advanced. If strength was strictly compared, Earth was most definitely the strongest such world in the history of the universe. Actually, it wasn't so exaggerated, but Earth was most definitely top 10. Lionel already had a plan in mind, and the sniper rifle he took from Xinghai's corpse would be perfect. It was time to begin the second step, purification. There were many ways to approach purifying a metal. In the world of force crafting, purification wasn't as simple as removing impurities. It was more accurate to say that this was the process of a force crafter treating a material to create a wanted result. Consider steel for a moment. Technically, steel is just iron with a certain concentration of added carbon. If Lionel's goal was to make steel, then his purification process would be taking iron and smelting carbon into it, thus producing the desired product. One must know that even amongst steel, there are various stages, purities and strengths among them. This is all decided by the process taken in forging the metal. Herb ore likewise works in this fashion. Lionel's goal was to temper the black herb ore such that its chemical structure was perfectly suited to the alloys of the sniper rifle. How well he performed this task was decided by a compatibility rating. Depending on the metals and materials used in the craft, the compatibility of a metal prepared, even in the same exact way, could vary. The methods he had to choose from were smelting, macroseparation, or oscillation. Lionel had already learned all 3 respectively via the techniques, melting hands, dancing string, and delicate touch. Without hesitation, Lionel began to use delicate touch. The ore became like a bouncing ball trapped between the cage that was his fingers. The movement of his hands became blinding. Despite the fact his arms and wrists were locked in place, his fingers continually flicked at the ore, causing it to slowly but surely turn a deeper and deeper shade of red as its body became hot. However, the odd part was that this red only seemed to appear in spots that didn't seem capable of spreading their heat elsewhere. The oscillation technique was one of induction. It was the process of agitating the chemical structure of the metal and raising its heat. But it was special in that it could target very specific chemical bonds, causing them to break and restructure themselves according to the force-crafter's will. This alone made the oscillation method the most difficult of the three. Controlling things on such a micro level while ensuring that the heat wasn't spread was nearly impossible for beginners. Of course, Lionel wasn't really controlling things on an atomic level. He was simply able to use his strong internal sight to separate the ore into larger sections to be tempered individually. It was impossible for the current him to create a 100% compatible metal, as that would require being able to use his internal sight to scan minerals at the level of chemical bonds. However, about 60% was well within his grasp. If others knew that Lionel was confident in such a thing, it would definitely cause an uproar. Even veteran black-grade force crafters would find 50 to 60% acceptable while 40% was passable. Something like 70% was already above average, 80% was elite, 90% was legendary, while 100% was basically folklore. Who could claim to be capable of commanding the trillions of atoms in and or perfectly? Lionel's force poured from his body and into little Tali without reservation, the rhythmic drumming of his fingers growing faster and faster. Beads of sweat fell from his forehead, but he didn't even take the time to wipe them, his eyes shining brighter and brighter with each passing moment. Dancing string. Lionel's rhythm abruptly changed as Tolliver shot out from his palms, covering the reddened ore. Lionel pinched his fingers on either side of the ore and pulled, elongating the hot ore into a thin line, folding it over itself and pulling once more. As though he was working a dough, Lionel stretched and folded the metal continuously, his fingers oscillating in a mesmerizing rhythm. Perfect. 67% is better than what I was expecting. Lionel didn't allow himself to bask in his success. He immediately reached toward the sniper rifle he had already separated into its parts the moment the black herb ore was prepared. Compared to the black herb ore, dealing with the pre-processed alloys of the sniper rifle was much easier. The compatibility rating of the herb ore was precisely decided by how well it could meld into these alloys. This meant that the last of Lionel's task was simply to combine the two and then inscribe his chosen force arts. He could almost see the final product before him. And, considering he had practiced many times in his dream world already, was failure even possible? Chapter 144. Lionel really didn't expect that he would be the subject of so many glares again so soon, but this was the reality before him. At this moment, he stood on the deck of a ship anchored a distance away from an island covered in a forest so thick one could hardly see in a few meters from its coasts. However, even with such a beautiful destination before him, Lionel found it difficult to enjoy because the youths that took part in the gathering were all sending looks toward him that just might tear him apart. However, Lionel really couldn't mind any of this now because compared to a few days ago, he was even more excited to go on this hunt. According to what the leading commander of this hunt just said, a commander that just happened to be the very same Violet Rain who oversaw the gathering, this hunt would decide who would gain a quota to enter an SS grade zone. This was most definitely an unexpected surprise for Lionel. Since Old Hutch hadn't known that Lionel had been scouting out high-level zones, he had never said anything about it. The old man hadn't said a word about it, thinking that he was successfully tricking Lionel into another task. He had no idea it would have convinced Lionel to join much quicker had he been more honest. As for the reason why Lionel was looking for high-level zones, that was obviously so that he could earn a Tier 9 black reward so that he could go to Terrain and find Aina. Unfortunately, Lionel had vastly underestimated just how rare high-level zones were. It could be said that he was both lucky and unlucky to stumble upon the France zone the way he had. Still, if others knew that Lionel was dissatisfied with the rarity of high-level zones, he would probably be beaten to death. After all, each zone needed to be cleared, it was a requirement. If zones weren't cleared, a world would never be able to finish their metamorphosis and could even have its timeline swallowed. It was most definitely in Earth's best interest that these zones were as rare as possible. Of course, such being the case, entering such a high-level zone wasn't a joke. This zone apparently had a 12-person entry limit, and only 3 spots would be available to them. The rest would go to high-ranking officials of the Slayer Legion who had great combat experience. But this alone was enough for Lionel to take this hunt more seriously. Entering this zone was essentially his ticket to seeing Aina again. If it could be said that before he was only a bit curious about what benefits this island might bring him, now he wouldn't allow anyone to get in his way. Those who collect the most beast crystals will be ranked accordingly. However, do keep in mind that this island isn't a controlled environment like you're used to. There's no way to know what kind of abilities these animals have awakened, nor is there any way to tell what sort of threat they pose. And if you believe the beasts are the only danger, you'd be wrong. The Eastern Lookout will be participating in this hunt as well. Be wary of the human heart. Violet Rain scanned the youths with an apathetic gaze. Though her eyes landed on Lionel for a moment, it didn't linger there any more than it did on another person. It seemed that she had regained her bearing as a commander in recent days. At the very least, her one-sided hatred of Lionel wasn't bubbling to the surface anymore. I've said all I've needed to say. You all can go. The youths were stunned. They could go? What was that supposed to mean? They were still hundreds of meters from the island. Even if it was before the metamorphosis, swimming in the ocean like this wasn't exactly the safest thing. Even if one disregarded the potential dangerous creatures, just swimming against the waves alone would sap up their energy. All of this was amplified several times more after the metamorphosis. It was widely accepted that the oceans of Earth were practically a forbidden zone now. If it was already difficult to explore the oceans before, it was at the point now where no one even dared to do so. It was at that moment that the boat they were all on suddenly rocked, caused by someone using it as a springboard to leap toward the open waters. When they saw who it was, flames of competition couldn't help but be lit in the depths of their souls. This was the man they all hated. If they lost to him in strength, it was still fine. But if they lost to him in courage too, where would they put their faces? Thunderous Clap watched Lionel's figure leap through the air. The eyes he had toward the latter didn't seem to contain the hatred it once had. Instead, there was a deep unwillingness and the fire of a competitive spirit. In truth, he still didn't believe he had misjudged Lionel. Since the others still weren't aware of the circumstances behind Indomitable's rise, they still thought Lionel was an arrogant prick. It was just that he happened to be an arrogant prick with the strength to back it up. However, hatred wasn't the emotion he had for Lionel. All he had said was the truth. He really could beat them without Hutch's help. In that case, it wasn't arrogance, it was simply a fact. I wonder, between him and those top few, who's stronger? Thunderous Clap was only ranked 4th. Yet, he knew that those the Slayer Legion truly saw as their future pillars wouldn't even be risked by being allowed to appear on the rankings. It was quite a joke. His goal was those people, yet he couldn't even rank first on the list they disdained to appear on. This was all to say that he couldn't fathom why it was they had allowed Lionel to appear on the list. But to him this was a good thing. He could finally measure himself to those hidden monsters. He finally had a target to chase after. The gazes of the youths watched on as Lionel glided across the waters as though it was solid ground. Then one after another they dove in. Violet Rain's watery eyes twinkled at this scene. I guess it isn't so bad even if he might be a spy. Like this, these little pups can have a fire lit beneath them. Chapter 145. Alright, it seems that this is the limit. At this moment, Lionel crouched on the highest branch of a tree that could support his weight, concealing himself within the dense foliage as he analyzed the gun in his hand. The gun had quite a simple, sleek, silvery black look to it. Its nozzle was especially long and narrow, leaving it heavily weighted toward the handle. But Lionel favored this design very much. Since it was like this, the long nozzle wouldn't influence his shot downward. Though the gun looked to be intact, if one looked closely, it was possible to see several fine cracks along its surface. Lionel estimated that this nozzle could at most take 2 more shots before it broke along the points of weakness he purposely built in. After testing it, Lionel knew the limits now, and they were exactly in line with the experimentation of his dream world. A single nozzle would last somewhere between 20 to 30 normal force shots. However, if he used his light elemental force, it would at most last 2 to 3 at most. If Lionel used the second phase of the gun and loaded it with a projectile he modified from his Otlotl darts, then it could shoot just 1. Though things were like this, there was good news as well. Lionel twisted and pulled the chipped nozzle off. After slipping his protective gloves on, he pulled little Tali from the segmented cube and got to work. He immediately activated Melting Hands. This technique worked similarly to Delicate Touch, in that it heated up materials using the oscillation of atoms. However, it was much simpler to use because its application was broader. Since the nozzle's alloys were already set, there was no need to use delicate touch to fine-tune the metal characteristics, so it was more of a brute force technique rather than a finesse technique. Lionel's fingers worked deftly. Almost like a musician plucking the strings of a harp, he worked in unison with the little metal spirit, melting down the metal. Upon sensing that the metal had reached the ideal temperature for molding, Lionel used spirit unity with little Tali to project the dream sculpt image of the nozzle's blueprint. This communication was extremely steady and completely without flaw, displaying the prowess of Lionel's ability once again. Most beginner force crafters who use metal spirits struggle with this step. The advantage of metal spirits is that they were able to mold metals into incredibly intricate parts just by comprehending the will of their partners. However, was this really so easy? How many could think of a single thing without straying? Even if you wanted to focus on a single thing, could you guarantee you wouldn't have a few stray thoughts? And even if you succeeded in not having any, could the image you projected truly be perfect? The human mind was known for playing tricks. Often, memories are easily distorted. The only way for a force crafter with a metal spirit familiar to circumvent this weakness is by constantly tweaking the image they send through spirit unity. Only in this way can they ensure the final product is perfect. However, Lionel had his dream sculpt? Was it even necessary for him to do such a thing? The image he projected would always be perfect. Little Tali acted quickly, wrapping the melted body up and shaping it into a thin rectangle of metal in what seemed like the blink of an eye. Lionel's eyes flashed, his palm flipping over to reveal a quill with a beautiful white feather. Taking advantage of the moment, Lionel's hands moved swiftly. Force art after force art was drawn across the surface of the floating rectangular piece of metal. Of these force arts there were three kinds. One was a force compression art, the second was a force acceleration art, and the third were force barrier arts. The force compression art concentrated the force Lionel poured into the gun into a fine point. The force acceleration art made the nozzle into a rail gun that accelerated the force bullet continuously. And finally, the force barriers were arranged along the inside of the nozzle such that the bullet was forced to follow a winding path that would give a stronger spinning action to the final product. There were multiple force arts of each kind dotted along the inside of the nozzle, making it look as though it was densely packed with graffiti. Yet, it still exuded a mysterious and somewhat ancient aura. The moment Lionel penned the last force art, the rectangular sheet of metal rolled close under little Tali's manipulation, forming a nozzle completely identical to the one that Lionel had just melted down. The only difference was that this one didn't have even a single crack on it. 16 minutes and 24 seconds. Not bad and getting faster. Lionel smiled to himself. If others knew that he had just force-crafted while squatting on the balls of his feet high up in a tree, it was just best you didn't compare yourself to others. Obviously, with how much time it took, Lionel couldn't do this mid-battle. But it was definitely not too much of an inconvenience. After all, he had 2 guns and 10 nozzles total. The only reason he had bothered to reforge this nozzle now was for the sake of preparedness. Since he had time now, there was no need to ruin a second nozzle, or else he wouldn't have time to cry later should a worst-case scenario situation happen. Lionel put the gun away after twisting the newly made nozzle onto it. Then he smiled, watching little Tali rush around his fingers as though the little guy was seeking credit. Yes, you did very good. Lionel didn't want to keep putting the little guy into the segmented cube, so he let little Tali stay out. His father had made it clear that keeping the little guy cooped up wasn't a good thing, so it was only right he let it out every once in a while. Alright, I've already collected over 20 beast crystals from a few B and grade threats. I guess I should look for a greater challenge this time. According to Violet Rain, B grade crystals were worth 1 point, grade were worth 10 points, and S grade were worth 100. There was a month of time, so though Lionel was fairly certain he was far ahead at the moment, he knew this wouldn't be enough for him to slack off. Suddenly, Lionel shook and fell from the tree branch. To an outside observer, it seemed that he had lost his footing and was now paying for it. But, just a moment later, the branch he was sitting at was blasted away. No, even the side of the tree trunk it was attached to looked like something had taken a bite out of it. The issue was that, there was nothing there. Despite the fact there was nothing to be seen with the eyes, Lionel's alertness was on high. He felt all the hairs on his body stand up, the residual effects of fusing with the primitive man's consciousness still benefiting him. Damn it, if I fall to the ground like this, it'll definitely break a few bones. Lionel's jaw clenched. At that moment, his back was facing the ground as he fell and his eyes were trained on the place the branch he squatted on had just been. If he didn't brace himself for the fall, he would suffer. But he still didn't dare to turn away. Lionel involuntarily blinked. It was a normal action, no different from the thousands of times he had already done it in his lifetime to this point already. However, he could have never imagined that, this time, it would come with dire consequences. It was only a split moment, but when Lionel opened his eyes once more, a streak of black was already about to hit his chest. Was it going to do to his torso what it just did to the tree? And why was it that his instincts were screaming at him, telling him that his quasi-bronze chain necklace would be of no help? Chapter 146, SS. Lionel's thoughts accelerated. A moment later he understood where this feeling was coming from. In the past several months he had learned quite a lot about force crafting. In that time, how could he not look into his quasi-bronze chain necklace? After suffering the barrage of several bombs, it had suffered a few minor cracks, but Lionel could tell that those minor defects actually decreased the strength of the treasure by as much as 10%. During his studies, Lionel had learned about the type of treasure his necklace was. As an energy-based defensive treasure, it also came with several downsides. One of those downsides was an inability to function in the presence of force-disrupting towers. This was something Lionel learned personally, much to the sadness of his shoulder. But, most importantly, it was incredibly fragile when meeting higher-level force types. What did this mean? It meant that whatever was in the process of attacking him now had grasped a force-strengthening deviation. Whether or not this force-strengthening deviation was powerful or not compared to other didn't matter. All that mattered was that it was at the very least a level beyond normal force. Damn it. Aren't these deviations supposed to be rare? How the hell did I randomly come across one like this? As Lionel continued to fall to the ground, he couldn't help but lament his bad luck once again. At the same time he caught the faint inkling that though this project hunt provided good opportunities, it could very well create new enemies for Earth as well. If there were other beasts this powerful. Let's just say Lionel didn't want to think about it. Just as the black light was about to collide with his chest, Lionel's right soul lit up and he stamped down hard, sending him shooting off to the side. As he did this he couldn't help but shake his head. First it was the chariot, now it was this weird creature. When he chose these treasure shoes he had never thought that instead of using it to glide through the air, had always be using it to escape a sorry state. Luckily he had already upgraded his treasure shoes. Now, the cooldown on their activation was only 30 seconds and they also provided a boost to his leaping ability. The moment he gained some distance, Lionel took out his 2 pistols, firing 4 rapid shots, 2 from each. Zigir, 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 zigir. Unlike a normal gun, the sounds of Lionel's shots were no different from whistling wind. However, even compared to a gun of the 25th century, though the range was at most half a kilometer, Lionel was confident that the piercing power and lethality was a few levels higher. 4 pellets of white energy shot forward, spinning so quickly that they left spirals of air in their wake. For the span of the blink of an eye, it seemed like they were the center of their own miniature hurricane. However, before they could even land on their mark, Lionel's eyes widened. The line of black energy vanished into thin air, blinking away before the energy spheres could hit it. Pooh, 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 pooh. The 4 bullets tore through the opposing tree, leaving the same number of small holes in its bark and easily tearing their way through the other side before disappearing into the foliage. The rustle of leaves sounded as Lionel disappeared into the dense canopy of a tree he had kicked himself toward. He landed on a branch with a dull thump, the wood beneath him swaying up and down beneath his weight. It disappeared? Lionel couldn't help but think back to Xinghai's blink ability. Could it be that this weird beast both had such an ability and access to a force-strengthening deviation? Wasn't this too exaggerated? If it had been any other youth who came across this creature, they'd likely already be dead. The greatest trouble was that Lionel's internal sight was seemingly having problems locking onto the target, almost as though it was able to hide from the fluctuations of his soul force. This made this beast 100 times more complicated to deal with. This is at least an SS-grade threat. Lionel silently waited for the beast to strike again. When facing an enemy like this, the worst thing he could probably do would be to move about randomly and allow it a chance to find an opening. It was best he stayed still, raising his awareness to its maximum and keeping his reflexes primed. As Lionel did this, he began to concentrate his internal sight into a smaller radius. This was a technique he learned in force crafting. It was usually used so that a crafter could maintain quality control of their craft by increasing their observational ability, but Lionel now realized that it applied perfectly to combat as well. He never thought there could exist something that could hide from his internal sight, but now he had been taught a lesson. He really had to be ready for anything in this new world order. The sharp range on Lionel's internal sight was continuously compressed by him. It took a toll on his spirit to do this, but he didn't have any other choice. How else could he deal with an enemy he couldn't see? 200 meters became 100. 100 meters became 50. 50 meters became 25. At this point, Lionel had reached his limit and as much as 5 minutes had already passed. But there was no sign of the beast that had attacked him. Lionel clenched his jaw and continued to wait, not moving even after half an hour had passed. But there was still no sign of the creature. With sweat pouring down his forehead, he had no choice but to release his internal sight, allowing him to gasp deep breaths. He knew by now that the likelihood the creature was still stalking him was low. Was it scared away? Lionel had always heard that animals were more afraid of humans than humans were of them. But he didn't really know if this was true or not. At the very least, it seemed that this beast was gone. Jumping down from the tree, Lionel soon landed on the ground. After taking a look around and realizing that the creature really wasn't going to attack him, he began to approach the center of the island with more caution. Lionel flipped his palm over, causing a silver disc to appear. What force-strengthening deviation did that beast use? Ping replying to Seed, there are fluctuations of dark elemental force in the air. Lionel didn't react much to this, but this was only because he wasn't aware of just how unlucky he was. Dark elemental force was just as rare as light elemental force. Yet, he had actually been marked by such an entity. At that moment, on the other side of the island, another ship could be found anchored. A group of youths jumped from its side, swimming toward the shore with ambitious glints in their eyes. However, neither those youths from the eastern lookout, nor the youths that came with Lionel from the southern lookout, was aware that there was a third gathering taking place as well. Nearby a large lake on the island, a gathering of beasts was taking place. Though none of them exchanged words in a human sense, their eyes seemed to tell a different story. From an outsider's perspective, all that could be heard was a series of grunts and growls. However, if one paid close attention and removed themselves from their preconceived notions, these animals seemed to be having a meeting. Chapter 147. Unlike the youths from the southern lookout who had been stimulated by Lionel to the point none of them even suggested forming a group upon entering the island, the youths of the eastern lookout were different. Without someone like Indomitable egging them on, they didn't think twice before forming groups of 2 or 3, walking through the dense forest together. The top 3 youths of the southern lookout, setting Lionel aside, were Roaring Black Lion, Chasing Wind, and Thunderous Clap. Likewise, the eastern lookout youths had their own top 3 as well. One would expect these youths to be leading groups of their own, maybe having too much pride to share a stage together. But this wasn't the case at all. In fact, the top 3 youths of the eastern lookout formed a group together, hoping to maximize their profits and monopolize all 3 spots to the SS grade zone to themselves. Ranked 7th on their promising rankings, there was a young woman who went by the name of Flowing Wind, a name not much different from the 3rd ranked of the southern lookout, Chasing Wind. Her form of dressing was particularly provocative. Other than a sports bra and a pair of skin-tight spandex shorts, she wore nothing else. Though her face was covered by a mask tattooed in red swirls not unlike Chasing Wind's green swirls, her fiery figure alone was enough to set one's mind ablaze. It could only be said that she put more worth in her looks than her own safety, or else she would never wear such a thing upon entering a forest with unknown dangers like this. Well, it was either that or she was extraordinarily confident in her abilities. Ranked 5th on their rankings, there was another young woman who went by the name Pisces. The first feature about her that stood out was her flowing blue hair. What was even more striking about this color was that it was possible to tell that this color was definitely not dyed in the slightest. It could only be said that her awakening had caused this mutation. Maybe it was something weird about the culture of the Eastern Lookout, but Pisces too was dressed particularly inappropriately. Though her clothing wasn't as provocative as Flowing Wind's, she still wore a flowing blue dress that was completely out of place. Not only this, but her dainty bare feet could be seen poking out from its folds with every step. She hadn't even worn shoes. As if these two weren't weird enough, the third of them was a young man ranked 2nd on their rankings. He went by the name of King of Seas. He carried around a golden trident that stood a head taller than him. It reflected the rays of the sun so well that it illuminated the forest despite how few rays made it through the thick canopy above. This alone wasn't enough to raise an eyebrow. The true problem was that he was wearing nothing but a Speedo, revealing his bronze torso and thighs, each portion of which was rippling with muscles. As though this wasn't enough to leave a person speechless, his Speedo seemed to be made out of a brass metal, making it look more like a chastity guard than a piece of clothing. It was impossible to tell whether this young man had done this on purpose or not. It could only be said that this group of three was simply too weird. There's something off about this forest. Flowing Wind spoke in a low voice. Though we've already gathered a few beast crystals, it doesn't seem to be as many as we should have. There was definitely something off. According to theory, animals should have the same chance at evolution as humans did. After all, there was no reason for the laws of the universe to favor humans over any other species. It wasn't impossible even for plants and vegetation to evolve. This was all to say that even if humans didn't go out of their way to breed powerful animal subspecies, they would have likely awakened powerful members among each other regardless. If this was taken into account, the beasts they had come across to this point should be far more powerful. But, from Flowing Wind's perspective, they seem to be quite normal. Your perspective is just skewed, Pisces said lightly. With the three of us here together, how could these animals not be easy to deal with? If you just consider the fact the most we've come across are B-grade threats, this is impressive enough. Maybe, it seemed that Flowing Wind was itching for battle. She was completely unsatisfied with the challenge and even somewhat regretted forming a team with these three. If things were like this, wouldn't the next month be too boring? If you're really feeling bored, there's still some other entertainment on this island, Pisces said with a light smile. We could just find a few of our peers from the southern lookout to exchange some pointers with. King of Sea's gaze sharpened at these words. It seemed that even though he was stoic and a man of few words, this prospect still made him feel quite anxious. Flowing Wind's steps paused. Finally, something interesting. Without saying a word, she shot into the distance, not even explaining her actions to her two team members. It was almost as though she didn't care whether or not they followed her. After sending a glance toward one another, King of Seas and Pisces could only shoot forward. Flowing Wind was their scout. Without her, finding the next target would be a few times more difficult. In the distance, Roaring Black Lion was in a fierce battle with a black bear. Considering he had already entered his beast form and the thin line of blood flowing from the corner of his lip, it was obvious that he wasn't having an easy time. It was a small clearing of green within the dense forest, yet it managed to contain such a savage battle. The palms of Black Roaring Lion and the black bear continuously slammed against their opposition's chest. They looked like two madmen having a contest of brute strength. If one looked closely, it was possible to see that the immediately vicinity of the black bear seemed to have sunk into the ground as though its great weight was affecting change on a much grander scale. Flowing Wind appeared by the edge of the clearing, her eyes lighting up when she recognized Roaring Black Lion's beast form. Rank 5th on the Southern Lookout rankings. Hee seems like you'll have a good harvest today. Chapter 148. Half a month later, Lionel could still be found walking around the forest. Though his harvest could be considered to be great, he was still in an incredibly sorry state. His quasi-bronze chain necklace managed to mend his clothes in places they had once been torn, but the limp in his gait, the caked blood and dried wounds on his skin, not to mention the paleness on his face were things it couldn't do anything about. This led to a situation where his clothes were in mint condition, yet his body looked like it had just gone through 100 consecutive battles. If one had followed Lionel from the start to now, one would see quite a weird scene. First, Lionel would find himself a beast to target. Second, he would easily kill that beast. And finally, just when he was feeling complacent in his victory, that very same damn streak of black would attack him from an unpredictable angle. At this point, Lionel had already had dozens of fights with that unknown beast. And though it couldn't be said that he always definitely lost, he most definitely didn't win either. It really was too much. He had no idea why this thing was targeting him, but it rarely even allowed him a moment to rest. By now, Lionel had learned from the dictionary that dark elemental force, and his light elemental force for that matter, weren't normal force strengthening deviations. Each was incomparably rare and powerful. But this only made him feel more aggrieved. Just what were the odds of a beast with such a rare ability deciding to target him? Where was the justice? At first, Lionel thought that maybe those with dark elemental force had some baked-in bias against those with light elemental force. But this didn't seem to be the case at all. He almost laughed at himself for having this thought. This wasn't some cheap anime his dad liked to watch. There wasn't any light side versus dark side nonsense going on here. This creature just apparently didn't like the way he looked. What other explanation could there be? Lionel sighed. In a motion he had practiced one too many times, he flipped his palm, allowing his long nozzle pistol to appear. He hardly shot a glance at his target before he fired, causing a white pellet of energy to pierce through the left eye of a fox that had been stalking him in some thick bushes. The poor thing hardly knew how it died. And once again, as though on cue, a flash of black headed for the back of Lionel's head. Lionel dove forward, ducking and rolling out of the way. Eat this. Light elemental force surged from Lionel's hand and into the pistol. A sharp eye would easily notice the nozzle bulge a small bit before a bead of golden energy shot out from it, barely able to hold out under the power of the bullet. Shoo. Bang. The streak of black dodged once more as usual, but Lionel heard its faint yip that almost sounded like the bark of a small dog. It usually made this sound whenever Lionel sent an attack toward it that could threaten it, and it was something Lionel had been hearing more and more often lately. The golden bullet collided with a tree that would take 10 men to wrap around. Yet, it was blasted through as though no more resistant than a piece of paper. The bark, the wood, its innards, all of it was completely vaporized. Even though Lionel didn't have much of a reaction to it now, the first time he had seen the strength of light elemental force, he was stunned silent. Lionel grit his teeth. You damned beast. Thanks to this thing he couldn't eat, sleep, or even relax. Yet there was still half a month more in this hellhole. How could he not be aggrieved? Unfortunately, before he could launch another attack, the beast disappeared again. Once again, from start to finish, Lionel didn't even catch a glance of what it was. He only managed to decipher that it must be a small creature of some sort. Outside of that, he really knew nothing else. Lionel took a deep breath, calming his agitation. He found a tree to lean against and slid down, taking a rest. Aside from this particular annoyance, this hunt couldn't be said to be completely without merit. For one, he had come into contact with many beasts that provided interested prospects for force crafting. The only unfortunate part was that none of these would help him to repair his chain necklace. Unfortunately, he didn't have the skill to repair such a high-level treasure. His 2 pistols could be ranked around the tier 5 or 6 black. It could be said that it was his accuracy and his light elemental force that made them so lethal. In his hands, they were no weaker than a tier 9 black treasure, but in someone else's, tier 6 was the best they'd be able to hope for. Such a treasure was about Lionel's limit at this moment, something that left him a bit disappointed. But, if these matters were put into perspective, just how shocking was it that Lionel, who had just stepped foot into the force crafting world, could already be considered a tier 6 black force crafter? Gem? Lionel noticed that there was someone coming toward him. But, since it was a human and not an animal, he didn't bother to move. This wasn't because Lionel assumed that this person wouldn't be hostile. The words thunderous clap had spoken to him were more than just a small wake-up call to him about the kind of world he lived in now. Rather, it was that he didn't think this person in particular could harm him even if they wanted to. When that person entered the clearing Lionel was resting in and saw that it was him, they were stunned for a while. Indomitable, it's you. The person didn't seem to be hostile. Of course, Lionel immediately recognized him. It was none other than Erupting Volcano, one of the young men Lionel had defeated during the gathering. It was easy to tell from the molten magma drawn directly onto his mask. Hello, Lionel said as a polite greeting. Though Erupting Volcano's face was covered by his mask, Lionel could tell from his eyes that he was stunned. Toward such a thing he could only bitterly laugh. Did they all really take him to be such a bad person? Even to the point they were shocked by something as simple as a greeting? Erupting Volcano suddenly felt hesitant, not knowing how he should approach. Lionel laughed lightly. If you have something you want to say, just say it. I won't bite you. Hearing such words, Erupting Volcano relaxed slightly. I don't know how much you know about what's going on right now. What's going on? Lionel's brow furrowed. As expected, you really weren't aware. In the past half-month, there've been a few skirmishes between us and the Eastern Lookout participants. We were caught off guard because most of us traveled alone while they traveled in groups. A lot of us got ambushed and had our stash of beast crystals taken away, so that's what happened. Lionel mumbled. You know about it? Well, a group did try to rob me a few days ago. But, Erupting Volcano smiled bitterly. Lionel didn't need to finish. He knew those people hadn't succeeded. Shaking his head, he continued. What's more pressing is the lack of S-grade and above beasts. Even grade beasts have been getting scarcer and scarcer. Lionel frowned. Now that he thought about it, this was true. He only didn't notice because that creature was always attacking him. He knew that little thing was at least an SS-grade threat. With such a beast constantly haunting him, where would he get the time to think about why stronger creatures weren't appearing? It can't be that we've already hunted them all? Lionel asked probingly. Erupting Volcano shook his head. That's impossible. Even though this island isn't as big as a continent, it's still at least 100 kilometers in diameter. The population of beasts should be in the tens of thousands. We don't even number 100 total. How could we clear them all in a few days? Lionel nodded. This made sense. So none of you have an answer to this? Well, we've been trying to go to the center of the island for a long time. The problem is that there are a lot of rivers and lakes blocking the way there with dense populations of dangerous underwater creatures. I'm actually part of a scout sent out to find and stragglers so we can come together to make a push. Hearing this much, Lionel fell into his own thoughts. Ultimately, he chose to follow only for the sake of his own curiosity. Why were the beasts acting so weirdly? Chapter 149. Near the center of the Project Hunt Island, there was a gathering of not-so-inconspicuous youths taking place. Some were looking toward one another with vigilance and hostility that could hardly be concealed. If one could set aside the peculiarity of the atmosphere, the surroundings itself was quite beautiful. Many lakes, rivers and rolling hills could be seen. The only issue was that it all seemed quite unnatural. It felt impossible that such a scenery could be formed organically. It was almost like a painter laid down a fantasy world on their canvas, only for it to somehow pop up and become a reality. The rivers wound in and out of the lakes like ribbons of water flowing as they pleased. Some of them didn't even take the green hills as obstruction, crawling up their sides and falling down the other in small waterfalls. It really was a beautiful sight. But it seemed that none of the youths had the mind to care about such things as they looked toward each other with vigilance. Roaring Black Lion stood to one side, his gaze practically spitting fire as he looked toward a group of 3 youths. There were numerous wounds across his body, making it obvious that Lionel wasn't the only one having a hard time during this hunt. But, judging by the hostility in his gaze, it was obvious that while Lionel was suffering at the hands of a beast, it seemed that he had suffered at the hands of his fellow man. It wasn't just him who had such wounds and carried such animosity. Aside from Chasing Wind, whose indifference was maybe somewhat obvious considering the speed at which he could escape, they all had such gazes, even Thunderous Clap. Towards such eyes, Pisces, Flowing Wind, King of Seas and the rest of the Eastern Lookout youths could only chuckle. Who asked the Southern Lookout promising youths to be stupid enough to travel alone? If it wasn't for this, would they have suffered such obvious losses? Of course, there was one group amongst the Eastern Lookout fellows that didn't seem to be having such a great time. However, rather than having their eyes trained on a particular person, they were constantly scanning the surroundings as though trying their best to find their prey. I know I'm beautiful, but is there a need to stare at me so intently? Flowing Wind blinked her eyes and brought her elbows together, winking flirtatiously at Roaring Black Lion and Thunderous Clap, both of whom had suffered due to her. The action was really too provocative. She was hardly wearing much to begin with. Now with this, it felt as though all her assets might pop out at any time. Thunderous Clap didn't even spare her a glance, but Roaring Black Lion looked her up and down. Despite the rage in his eyes not dispelling, it seemed he was perfectly fine with enjoying the show. And why not? He didn't have to turn a blind eye to her beauty just to get his revenge, right? He would teach her a lesson regardless. If you want to look some more, I don't mind. But you'll have to get a little closer. Flowing Wind said sweetly. I wouldn't mind coming closer, but you look a bit fragile. I might accidentally snap you half. But that's exactly what I want. Flowing Wind blinked with expectation as though hoping Roaring Black Lion would cross the distance between them at that very moment. She looked every bit the part of a woman who couldn't wait a moment longer. However, the underlying murderous intent was clear to the point that if one closed their eyes and only focused on her words and not her tantalizing figure, it would sound as though she was inviting you to the depths of hell rather than her bed. That said, Roaring Black Lion didn't seem to notice as he took numerous broad steps forward. In a moment, he was so close to Flowing Wind that her ample chest just barely grazed along his ribcage. She stood with her hands on her hips, looking up at Roaring Black Lion with an expectant glint in her eye. Just when it seemed that the atmosphere might take a turn for the worse, the sound of shuffling grass and a snapping twig sounded. Many looked over to find a pair walking toward them, both of who were young men. One had molten lava painted onto his mask, while the other wore a plain white one. Everyone on the Southern Lookout side seemed to recognize both young men and even shot complicated gazes toward the latter. However, a hint of confusion could be seen amongst those of the Eastern Lookout. Well, almost all of them. There was one particular group that seemed to have found the prey they were looking for. Almost like ravenous dogs tied to a chain they couldn't wait to free themselves from, they stared toward Lionel with all the animosity they could muster. You know who he is? Pisces, who was used to being the only one of her group of three who thought about the overall situation, noticed this distinct change. Through gritted teeth, a young man who had red veins painted across his mask and went by the name Ruptured Artery spoke. We were tied up in a tree and couldn't get down for 3 days because of him. We nearly starved to death. Pisces frowned upon hearing this information. He was alone. Yes. And he still subdued you all without killing you? Yes. Or injuring you. At this point, Ruptured Artery stopped speaking. He was already enraged enough without having to deal with the odd gazes he and his group was now receiving. However, the others of the Eastern Lookout could only look toward Lionel with vigilance. Ruptured Artery wasn't the best among them, but he wasn't the worst either. If he participated in the Southern Lookout gathering, he would have been the 4th or 5th seed. On top of that, he had been alone, yet he had been tied up in a tree without the ability to resist. Even with all this being said, the reason they were so apprehensive was because Lionel was a complete unknown. They had never even heard of him until this very moment. Chapter 150. Lionel didn't react much to all of the eyes on him. He was much more interested in learning what was going on here. This place looked so beautiful, but judging by the fact they were all at least 100 meters away from the nearest riverbank, nothing was as simple as it seemed. Hello. Lionel spoke first. Though he didn't think the amiable smile he had on right now was helping very much considering the fact he was wearing a mask, he still used it out of force of habit. Those of the Southern Lookout responded to Lionel's greeting with awkward nods, while those of the Eastern Lookout didn't say much of anything. Most were only curiously observing Lionel. However, the young man in question walked by them all and approached the closest riverbank. Indomitable weight. Surprisingly, it was Roaring Black Lion who called out. Hearing the voice, Lionel couldn't help but stop and look back. It's dangerous. There's a group of creatures hidden in the lake led by an exceptionally powerful leader. Some of us almost lost our lives. When he was saying these words, Roaring Black Lion sent glares toward the Eastern Lookout youths once again. They had reached this place long before they had, yet hadn't said a word. Obviously, he had more than just one grievance with this group of people. Lionel nodded. Got it? Just want to check something. Lionel turned back and continued to walk forward. Roaring Black Lion didn't try to stop him again, he had already done all he could. Plus, it wasn't like he could stop Lionel by force. It wasn't long before Lionel had made it to the side of the closest river. He tried to reach in with his internal sight, but he suddenly found that passing it through water was a lot different than air. In fact, his range was reduced by a factor of 10, barely stretching down a couple tens of meters. In truth, this should have been enough to make it to the bottom of most rivers. But the issue was that not only was this river much deeper than usual, but even if it wasn't, the fact was that there was still the rest of its length and width to deal with. Even if he could see to the bottom, he could still only look to the left and right a few tens of meters. It didn't take Lionel long to decide that it was a fruitless endeavor. Instead of continuing to do something useless, he flipped his palm, causing the corpse of a deer with particularly sharp antlers to appear in his hands. The others were stunned by this. Some even had eyes that gleamed with curiosity and greed, most of whom came from the Eastern Lookout. It wasn't that those of the Southern Lookout were better people, it was just that they knew enough about Lionel to not foolishly think of stealing his things. Spatial treasures were already innately high-grade treasures. They were all at least grade treasures. But this alone wasn't enough for them to turn their greedy eyes toward Lionel. The most important point was how large of a space Lionel's spatial treasure must have. What they didn't know was that this carcass wasn't taken from Lionel's spatial bracelet, but rather from his segmented cube. In recent days, Lionel was really lamenting not knowing more about the segmented cube earlier. It was actually able to house little Tali just fine even while within his spatial ring. Had he known this earlier, he could have stored Aina inside it while he escaped that day instead of sending her off to some unknown world. But at this point he could only sigh. It wasn't like he could go back in time. Lionel turned his attention back to the riverbank. Then, with strength that surpassed a normal human, he tossed the deer carcass toward it. The reaction was immediate. The calm surface churned. In one moment there was not a life form in sight. But in the next moment, the water suddenly fell as though a pit hole had appeared at its bottom. Then a massive mountain of blue shot up. Beneath the towering wave of water, Lionel could faintly catch a glimpse of beautiful reflective blue scales. Without hesitation he pulled out his pistol, shooting a single normal shot. He thought that this would be all he needed to end things. But the result was far outside of his expectations. Ding! Lionel's shot didn't even leave a dent. It rebounded off, causing Lionel to look in shock as his shot landed on a nearby patch of grass, burrowing into the soil. After a moment, Lionel smirked. Well, good thing I picked that beast in particular. The massive scaled creature fell back into the waters, causing waves to flood over the sides toward Lionel. However, he didn't move, weathering the storm. What is he doing? This was a question many of the youths were asking each other. Why was he standing in such a dangerous place? It should be obvious that normal methods weren't enough now. Kua. There it is. Lionel's gaze grew focused. This was exactly what he was looking for. Don't blame me. Lionel grinned to himself. I've lost count of the number of times I've gotten fish bones caught in my throat. Consider this a little payback. The rage of the massive beast shook the river. Lionel could imagine its pain. That deer he had fed it was no joke. Lionel had defeated it easily, but after testing the strength of its sharp antlers, the result shocked even him. One could imagine the damage it could do inside that creature's stomach. However, this wasn't all Lionel wanted. He was still biding his time, still waiting. By now the other youths realized that Lionel had done something. As for whatever it was clear that it was very effective. There it is. The creature surged up once again, doing whatever it could think of to try and alleviate the pain it was suffering. At that moment, Lionel did the unthinkable and jumped into the air with it. Chapter 151. Lionel surged toward the towering beast. With his improvement to his treasure shoes, even without activating its formation, his leaping ability was now beyond the realms of reason. Even jumping 20 to 30 meters into the air was no longer impossible. In a flash, he had already appeared above the creature, his palms flipping over to reveal two pistols. Wow! Despite the fact his goal was to kill this creature, Lionel couldn't help but hesitate in the last moment. It was simply too much of a work of art. Before the metamorphosis, seeing such a beautiful creature was too difficult. Or even if they did exist, they were on a much smaller scale than this. He could immediately tell that this creature was some kind of mutated koi fish. Its scales were various shades of blue, varying from what was almost a deep black to a sky blue. Its fins shot through the air almost like a pair of wings, and its tail fin, especially, flowed almost like the hair of a gorgeous woman. If there were any hardcore environmentalists here, there was no doubt they'd rip him apart for even daring to have thoughts on such a creature. But at this point the die had been cast. If he didn't shoot not, he would be the one in danger. Sorry, big guy. Lionel fired a series of shots, unrestrainingly concentrating his shot on the eyes of blue koi fish. Kuwawa. The bullets of white left spiraling trails of spinning wind in their wake, tearing a path through the raining water that shed reflective droplets in every which direction. The damage was undeniable. A spray of violet blood leaked from the blue koi's eyes as its body tried to flop back down to the river. But would Lionel allow this? A layer of green enveloped Lionel's right sole. He launched himself forward, sending a strong kick toward the massive fish that knocked it toward the land. Without pausing, the sole of his other shoe lit, stopping his rebounding force and sending him back toward the shore. Lionel thought it would all be over at this point. A fish out of water, no matter how large it was just a fish out of water. It was self-explanatory. In fact, it was even more exaggerated considering how injured it was now. But Lionel had forgotten to consider one important thing. Just what was this koi fish's ability? Just when the blue-scaled koi fish was about to land on solid ground, a shocking change took place. It took a dive as though it was going into water. At first, Lionel thought that this was simply because it was blinded. Maybe it was in so much pain that it hadn't even registered the fact Lionel had just kicked it. But in the next moment, Lionel was left speechless. The ground the koi fish should have landed against suddenly became as fluid as water. No, that wasn't it. It had actually become water. Lionel could only watch as what once was solid land suddenly became a lake. And then, as the fish rampaged, completely blind to its surroundings, it became a winding river. Suddenly everything made sense. The odd structure of this island, the seemingly fantastical ways lakes and rivers appeared, the random and impossible to explain waterfalls. It was all the doing of this fish. Lionel's eyes widened, realizing that blinding this beast was maybe one of the worst things he could have done. Now it was blind, in pain and enraged? On top of having such an ability? Run! Lionel roared. From start to finish, the youths of both lookouts had been watching with shocked expressions. Lionel's actions seemed to get more and more wild with each passing moment. Lionel fell through the air. The process was completely out of his control. He had already used both platform jumps of his treasure shoes, and though he had improved them greatly, the cooldown time was still 30 seconds. Where there was dry land below him before, there was suddenly a vast and steadily growing lake. Well, maybe calling it a lake wasn't accurate because the erratic movements of the koi fish made it look like a toddler had randomly scribbled onto a page. However, Lionel wasn't worried. If it was before, he would fear a battle on the water. But after he observed Old Hutch's use of force, he was able to glide on the surface of the lake. As far as he knew, there were no invalids on this island. Maybe they had already been weeded out by the beasts, or maybe they'd taken out by the overseers of Project Hunt. Even if this wasn't the case, the invalids who would appear here would all be beast types, so they wouldn't be interested in Lionel to begin with. So, he wasn't shy with using his force at all. Lionel landed heavily on the surging waves below, his body sinking in to the point his hips were submerged before the buoyancy of his force sent him shooting back up. This is difficult. Lionel thought, his jaw clenched. He had used this ability to run from the boat that brought him here to the island. But back then the ocean had been fairly calm. He hadn't thought that it would be so much more difficult when the water was agitated. I need to end this quickly with a light elemental shot. Had Lionel not been too conservative in his approach before, he most definitely could have ended this earlier. But it was impossible even for him to predict everything. Dealing with such a beast is what I'm built for. At that moment, the quiet and stoic King of Seas suddenly became a totally different person, charging forward in his brass speedo with trident in hand. Lionel frowned, but he didn't say much. If there were others with water abilities, it really could be useful. Those without them had already heeded his advice and retreated by a long measure. The only exceptions were those who were seemingly able to use force just like him. The Slayer Legion has force users? Lionel felt that maybe he had to re-evaluate this group of rebels again. While his mind was half wandering, half focusing on the battle before them, their movements had caught the attention of the beast toward the center of the island. Their intelligent eyes flickered with a peculiar light. Chapter 152. Lionel's eyes madly scanned the body of water beneath him. Since his internal sight was so limited upon entering liquids, his best reliance was his eyes. Though it was true that this koi fish's ability was troublesome, there were some benefits to it as well. For example, the bodies of water it created were perfectly clear and without impurities, making it much easier to see through. The only thing that could disrupt Lionel's vision was the agitated water. But wasn't this agitation perfect for telling exactly where that massive fish was? At that moment, King of Seas soared into the air, diving down. Lionel faintly caught the sight of his skin growing greenish-blue scales just before he entered the water. Lionel didn't stop him. With such an ability, King of Seas was indeed a good candidate for taking the vanguard. The trouble was that Lionel was certain this fish was far stronger than King of Seas, judging by his stats. However, King of Seas had two advantages. Firstly, Lionel had already blinded the koi fish. And secondly, Lionel had yet to get a clean look at his stats after his transformation. It was possible that Lionel had underestimated him. Pisces shot a look toward Flowing Wind. But after a brief communication with their eyes, the latter shook her head no. Pisces immediately understood. It seemed that Flowing Wind's scouting ability was useless in the water. After confirming this, she shot forward along the green grass while Flowing Wind rose into the air, stepping on the wind as though it was solid ground. As though not to be outdone, Chasing Wind soared into the air as well, followed quickly by Thunderous Clap. Roaring Black Lion hesitated for a moment, but chose to stay back. That said, it didn't mean he would do nothing. He quickly morphed into his humanoid beast form, filling his chest with air and billowing out with a roar that shook the surroundings. Lionel had been right. Roaring Black Lion's ability wasn't as simple as a transformation and a strength boost. He had a suppression ability he called King of Beasts. Though it worked on humans, it was especially effective on animals and had much more room to grow. In this sort of situation, even though he couldn't partake in the fight directly, his role was still invaluable. After his roar, the wild movements of the koi fish slowed considerably, allowing King of Seas to catch up and land a resounding strike with his trident to its side. A tornado of water blasted forward, sending the koi fish upward with an unquenchable momentum. Pisces reacted quickly. Droplets of water seemed to form around her like sparkling lights as her dress and hair fluttered. Though she could be looked down upon for actually wearing a dress to such an occasion, one could only admit that she looked amazing doing it. Flowing wind and chasing wind reacted at that instant as well, causing the wind in the surroundings to kick up a storm that fused in the rising tornado of water. Kuuwawa. The koi fish shot higher and higher into the air, unable to extricate itself. It was completely helpless. Ha! This kill will be mine, King of Seas. King of Seas controlled the water around him, forming a miniature tornado of his own to shoot into the skies after the koi fish. When he appeared, many couldn't help but be stunned. Greenish-blue scales covered him from head to toe. Odd fish-like membranes snapped closed and open over his eyelids. Fins jetted out the side of his face and webbing coated the distance between his fingers and toes. Any way you looked at him, he was a fishman of legend. He grinned a savage, jagged grin, a sharp row of teeth shimmering beneath the sunlight as he soared into the air. Pulling his trident back, he mustered all his strength, using the water tornado beneath him to propel him forward and bring more power to his strike. He could almost see it. The sight of the fish being skewered. Whenever he activated his ability and entered this form, his blood would boil. As though he had a long lineage of ancestors who lived for battle and blood, an excitement that dug deep into his bones would take hold of him. Because of this, a young man who was usually quiet and stoic would now have these outbursts where he had to kill. His trident needed to taste blood or else he wouldn't rest. Who knew that in all his confidence, his trident would rebound off of the koi fish's scales as though he had smashed into a steel plate. His savage expression changed as a jarring pain assaulted his arm. The rebound force was so strong that he felt his shoulder almost dislocate completely. And, despite the fact it didn't, he could sense a few micro tears pulling at the muscles in his arms. The koi fish was sent flying toward the ground again, but this time no one seemed happy about it. They all knew what would happen. The ground would turn into a body of water once again, and who knew if they'd be able to catch that fish again. But it was at that moment that a young man who had been doing nothing but scanning the lake's surface this whole time suddenly moved. It was too bad for this koi fish, but 30 seconds had passed. The water beneath Lionel's feet bubbled as his force surged into his legs. Bang! The surface beneath his feet exploded as he launched himself into the air. Due to losing some of the momentum, he only managed to jump 10 meters, but to Lionel he felt that this was more than enough. The moment he felt his momentum faltering, another green light blossomed beneath his soul. This time he jumped over 20 meters, appearing above the flopping fish, 2 pistols in hand. He didn't hold back this time around. Both pistols were outfitted with a bullet that jetted out from the nozzle like an arrow. In fact, instead of calling it a bullet, it would be more appropriate to call these loaded pistols harpoons. If it was a regular shot, Lionel could shoot 20 to 30 times. If it was a light elemental force shot, Lionel could shoot 2 to 3 times. But if it was this harpoon modified from his darts, he could only shoot once. There was a good reason for that. Bang! Kuuwawa. The koi fish flopped to the ground with a resounding boom. But this time there was no new lake or river to speak of. Chapter 153. Lionel landed on the koi fish, exhaling a long breath. At the same time, a bit of fear couldn't help but creep into his heart as well as a bit of anticipation. This koi fish's ability was really too sinister. If he had been fighting alone, it could be said that he would have had a much harder time even if it ended in his victory. As for why he was filled with anticipation, it was of course because if he could refine the ability into a treasure, the potential applications were tantalizing. Lionel most wanted this ability for its application in escape. He could tell that the koi fish wasn't creating water, but was instead transforming earth into water. If this was a treasure instead of an ability and it was tweaked a bit, wouldn't it be possible to escape through the ground? There was another type treasure Lionel was thinking of making, but for now he lacked the skill. Of course he hadn't forgotten about Xinghai. If he could turn Xinghai's blink ability into a treasure, his combat prowess would take another leap. But Lionel neither had the necessary materials, nor the skill to do anything with this idea. Any such treasure would be of, at the very least, the quasi-bronze grade. Obviously this was beyond him. Lionel sighed, looking at the pistols in his hands. The nozzles had exploded from the inside out, leaving them useless. Unfortunately, now was definitely not the best time to repair them, so he could only continue from here with 8 nozzles remaining. After putting them away, Lionel made his way to the wound in the koi fish's eye and coated his arm in force. Reaching inside and relying on his internal sight, he was able to dig out the beast crystal with ease. The beast crystal looked like a smooth blue pearl, emitting a faint watery smell. The kind one would experience by a freshwater lakeside. "What do you think you're doing?" Lionel frowned, turning back to see King of Seas looking toward him with an unfriendly gaze. He had already dismissed his ability transformation, but judging by the red in his eye, he was still suffering from a bit of bloodlust. It was immediately obvious to Lionel that he was looking at the beast crystal in Lionel's hand. It was only now that Lionel remembered that to the other promising youths who had come with him, the beast crystals provided an opportunity to evolve their abilities. Even if Lionel discounted King of Seas, there was still Pisces as well. How could they not both want a beast crystal from such a powerful water-type creature? What old Hutch had neglected to tell Lionel was that if one ingests a beast crystal from a creature with similar abilities, there's even the possibility of mutating and improving one's ability as well, making it even more desirable. This beast was at least of the SS grade in the eyes of these youths. Just how much would their abilities improve if they were to ingest it? King of Seas was especially looking forward to the potential defensive boost to his scales if he ingested it. Back then, his trident hadn't even left a scratch after his full-powered attack. As for Pisces, she was especially fond of the water transformation ability. As things stood now, she could only pull water vapor from the air when there were no other sources around. This was the source of all those beautiful sparkles floating around her when she attacked. If she was able to evolve her ability in this way, it could be said that she would instantly become one of the most powerful on Earth, let alone her generation. Regardless of who it was between them, it held lethal allure. "Hey, you ungrateful bastards from Eastern Lookout. Indomitable got the final kill, don't you think you're a bit too shameless asking what he's doing? Obviously he's taking his spoils." Roaring Black Lion didn't back down even a step. "Taking his spoils?" Pisces asked indifferently. "It was all 7 of us who worked together to take down the fish, yet he didn't say a word before digging out the beast crystal himself. Even if he deserves the largest share, something that's still up for debate, he should at least discuss it with the rest of us, right?" Those from the Southern Lookout frowned. What was up for debate? They all saw that King of Seas couldn't even scratch the beast's scales with his strongest strike. As for the rest of them, they only played a part in launching it into the air, something Lionel already proved would happen regardless as long as they were a bit more patient. It could be argued that Lionel could have taken the beast out without help at all. The only reason those of the Southern Lookout stepped in was because they didn't want to remain idle while the Eastern Lookout youths acted. Roaring Black Lion sneered. "Don't say I didn't warn you. He's not a person you can deal with just by ganging up like you did with me." Flowing Wind and Chasing Wind descended from the skies. Since Flowing Wind didn't need the beast crystal as his ability had nothing to do with water, she didn't join in. As far as she was concerned, this wasn't an Eastern versus Southern Lookout issue. This was purely a fight for benefits. There was nothing personal. She felt no need to put herself in any potential danger for the sakes of King of Seas or Pisces even though they were teammates. Toward Roaring Black Lion's words, Pisces and King of Seas sneered. "Can't deal with just him?" King of Seas laughed, the red in his eyes brightening a bit more. If Lionel's guns hadn't broken right before their eyes, they might still fear him. But they all saw for themselves how they splintered and exploded. Of course a weapon capable of killing an SS-grade threat was enough to make them fear, but wasn't this weapon destroyed now? Of course, these two simply had no idea that Roaring Black Lion wasn't referring to Lionel's treasures at all. How could they know? By now they had already assigned the loss of that Eastern Lookout group led by Ruptured Artery to Lionel's guns. Now that they were out of the picture, there was nothing to fear. Lionel scanned King of Seas and Pisces, his gaze expressionless. Chapter 154. The Lionel of the past might have really been surprised by this turn of events. In the world he was used to, even if people held such greed in their hearts, they wouldn't display it so openly. But after his run-in with Thunderous Clap, he had already come to accept it. This was his new world now. "I will be taking this beast crystal as it's useful to me. He'll also be taking a few of its scales and meat as well, but with a beast of this size, there's more than enough to go around for us all." Lionel said words he was planning on saying anyway before King of Seas spoke. If he really wanted to slight these people, he could easily take the entire beast into his segmented cube. With his strength and means, would any of them even be capable of stopping him from doing so? The fact he hadn't was already an act of kindness. In Lionel's mind, the most important thing to him now is getting back to Aina. In order to do so, he needed to have adequate strength. It was impossible to tell what might be going on terrain. When it came to matters related to Aina, he had no patience for nonsense, even if half that nonsense came from a beauty. A suffocating aura bloomed from Lionel's body. He had never been able to control this aura, but whenever his emotions became especially focused, it involuntarily leaked. Toward this change, it wasn't just King of Seas and Pisces that suddenly found it difficult to breathe. Even the youths from the southern lookout could only look toward Lionel with ghastly pale expressions. They had never sensed such a thing from Lionel, and how could they? That day Lionel had been so tired. How could he possibly focus his emotions? Had he been able to focus on the task at hand like he usually did, they would have long since been drowned out by his aura. In that moment, the red in King of Sea's eyes completely retreated as though it had met something it feared. Lionel hadn't done a thing. He simply stood there and spoke. But even if he told others that he wasn't purposely trying to suppress them, who would believe him? All the youths from the southern lookout only looked toward Lionel with more fear. Could it be that he had really held back that day? Or had he really been tired? That hadn't been a joke? After realizing what was happening, a flash of embarrassment and anger appeared on King of Sea's face. However, but he could do anything about it. What happened next left him stunned. The very guns he thought were already broken were taken out by Lionel once again. They could only watch as he calmly twisted the broken nozzles off and replaced them with new ones as though nothing had ever happened. King of Seas and Pisces couldn't help but gulp. This was already Lionel's final warning to them. If they really insisted on continuing, then he wouldn't mind teaching them a lesson. The last group that tried ended up in a tree for a few days. Lionel had no problem doing that again. Though there was now hesitation in the eyes of the two water ability users, Lionel could see that their resolve was slowly growing firmer. This sort of opportunity, it came once in a lifetime. Most of the water ability beasts could only be found in the ocean, but who dared to venture into it? The waters were simply too dangerous, and who knew what beasts evolved down there out of their control? In addition, just being an aquatic beast didn't guarantee a water ability either, and even if it did, it was unlikely to be as good as the one in Lionel's hands right now. Even with all this being said, there was another, maybe even more important, reason they had to do this. This place was one where they would be the strongest. And they could tell that Lionel wasn't comfortable with battling inside of water. If they tried to take this battle elsewhere, their strength would be greatly diminished. There was no better place for them to battle than by all of this water. Just when everyone was preparing for battle, the sound of a raging beast came from the distance. Lionel's pupils shrunk. It's not just one beast. Bang. An explosion caused many of the youths present to feel their ears rupture and begin to bleed. At first, it was impossible to tell exactly where this explosion had come from and what had caused it. It was simply too loud. But, a moment later, a raging pillar of billowing white steam shot into the air in the distance. The pillar was so thick and vibrant that it could be seen from over 10 kilometers away with a clearness that made it feel as though it was right before them all. Force. Lionel's eyes widened. That pillar, he could feel it. It was a flood of force with a level of density he couldn't fathom. Is that the force crystal mine old Hutch was talking about? Is it supposed to explode like that? Worry began to bubble up in Lionel's heart. Before, he was freely using his force because he was certain that there weren't any invalids on this island. With his density of force, the invalids that could threaten him were too far away. Plus, they would all be creatures of another species, so they wouldn't bother with him either. But this density of force was on another level. In addition, if it really came from the force crystal mine, that meant it didn't come from any one species and might very well attract creatures of all kind. If this island was suddenly surrounded by an infestation of aquatic invalids, what could they do? How the hell would they get out of this place? Lionel's blood ran cold. Chapter 155. Lionel was likely the first to realize the problem, but he most definitely wasn't the only one. In the recent battle, many of the youths had displayed some level of force manipulation, whether small or big. There was no doubt they knew exactly what the geyser in the distance was. This isn't good. Not only would this geyser cause the island to be quickly surrounded by aquatic creatures, but there wasn't any guarantee that these creatures wouldn't come inland as well. It was wishful thinking to hope that they wouldn't. Lionel had already learned that lesson once before. The only way is to quickly stop that thing. After making this decision, Lionel aimed his pistol at the fish corpse beneath his feet, powering it with lethal light elemental force and firing. His sudden action caused many who had been paling under the stress of the sudden change of events to whip their heads toward him. However, by then, Lionel's purpose had already been accomplished. He had perfectly aimed his shot toward a vulnerable point between the scales of the koi fish, causing them to bend at that point. Then he reached down and pulled up with all his might, ripping the scales free from the dead beast's body. He worked quickly. In what felt like the blink of an eye, he had already pulled off over 10 beautiful blue scales, each of which was over a foot in length and about half of that in width. When he had about 20 in his possession, Lionel stopped, having stored them all within his spatial ring. Then he looked off into the distance. If you all want to survive this, I suggest we put aside petty disputes for now and head over there. If we don't stop it, we're finished. Lionel's calm voice had a magnetic appeal to the youths around him. They couldn't help but instinctively want to listen. Going over there? Are you insane? Of course. How could everyone be of one mind? Where there were those with one thought, there would always be those with the opposing. This was just the way of the world, the way things worked. The person who spoke was none other than Ruptured Artery. Despite his history with Lionel, he hadn't spoken out of spite. Instead, he spoke on instinct. How could that place not be dangerous? This koi fish was the very first SS-grade threat they had ever met, and they all very clearly realized that they couldn't do anything to it. If it wasn't for Lionel, they would have forever been unable to cross this region toward the center of the island. Knowing this, it was obvious to them that there was likely more than one such creature like this here. And this also explained the scarcity of beasts as well. If they linked all of these points together, there was most definitely a horde of dangerous beasts maybe no less powerful than the fish beneath Lionel's feet ahead. After thinking to this point, how could they possibly dare to continue forward? The best choice was to wait for their overseeing commander to come back and retrieve them. I will only say a few more words to convince you. If they fall on deaf ears, I won't be responsible for what happens to you after this. 1. You're not the only ones in danger. Your commanders, waiting offshore for you all, are in even more danger than we are. There's nowhere to hide on the open ocean. Lionel had hardly begun when the youths turned several shades more pale. Having thoughts that their commanders were infallible would be utterly stupid. The metamorphosis just began. Even though higher-ranking officials could be said to have far greater combat experience than them as youths, the truth was that there wasn't a large power disparity between them and their commanders. There were very few exceptions to this. Geniuses like Old Hutch who could make progress even in a third-dimensional world, then explode with all their potential now were incredibly rare. Simply put, there were most definitely no such people amongst the commanders. 2. Time is of the essence. Even if the commanders could deal with the initial wave, could they survive a second, a third, a fourth? If you want any hope of making it off this island, the quicker the geyser is dealt with, the better. And 3, you really don't have much of a choice. Lionel looked into the distance with a solemn expression. The direction he was looking at was surprising. In fact, he was looking toward the complete opposite direction of the force geyser. The dense forest of trees began to rumble and quake. First it was subtle. It was an ever so slight swaying of the grass or rustling of the leaves. Then it felt as though the ground itself was trembling. Soon, even the thick trees themselves began to swing to and fro as though made of rubber. The promising youths looked toward their backs with an eerie cold permeating their hearts. They suddenly understood what Lionel meant. Though the number of beasts in the forest was less than they imagined there would be, there were still many there. It was enough for Lionel to have killed over 20 in just his first few moments on this island. Even if the number was lacking. If they were all to converge on this point, they really didn't have a choice but to continue forward. If they tried to fight against the tide of beasts, wouldn't they be swallowed whole before even realizing what happened? Having said what he needed to say, Lionel didn't hesitate to dash into the distance toward the geyser, thinking to himself that he most definitely needed a treasure capable of transportation soon. But unfortunately, that would require crafting something much larger than he ever had before. In force crafting, difficulty wasn't just decided by the overall grade of the treasure, but also the size of it. A craft that was extremely small or large was definitely much harder to craft even compared to a craft several levels higher in grade. However, now wasn't the time to think about such things. Lionel could only lament his bad luck. This was supposed to be an easy trial he could place first in with a minimum amount of effort. Why had it suddenly become a life or death situation? Something about all of this felt off. Things weren't so simple as they seemed. Chapter 156. Lionel crossed lake after lake and river after river. He knew that the youths were quickly following behind him, hoping to put some distance between them and the beast horde coming from the dense forests. The wild, thunderous roars and booming tremors seemed to be getting closer and closer. Lionel's internal sight remained vigilant, but his expression was only growing more and more solemn. He noticed that his senses were growing less sharp. It was almost as though something was interfering with his ability to see the whole picture clearly. It must be the increased density of force, or maybe it's the fact that force is so unrestrained and volatile. Lionel didn't have a perfect answer, but this was his best guess. However, he didn't get a chance to think of any more examples because his footsteps suddenly came to a grinding halt. His heels dug into the ground in an exaggerated manner. It was to the point he almost fell backward. Just now, he had reached the top of the largest hill in this stretch of land, only to find a sight that his heart plummet. Though this was an island with a relatively circular shape, there was just a single path toward the center of it. This was precisely why the actions of the blue koi fish had stalled the youths for so long. With it taking control of the single path forward, they had to either find a way to bypass it or kill it the very same way Lionel had. The reason that there was just this singular path was because entrances from all other angles were flooded with deep valleys that seemingly had no entry points. Together, they became deep pits with unfathomable depths. Flowing wind and chasing wind had already considered the idea of simply flying over these valleys. But, for whatever reason, that still ended in failure. As for exactly why, maybe only those two women knew. At this moment, those valleys became those eerie death pits once more, trapping them. The trouble was that they weren't trapping them outside, but rather, inside this time around. However, just this alone didn't warrant this reaction from Lionel. He had already known about the deep valleys that blocked the path to the center of the island. After all, he had been here for half a month. How could he not think of venturing further and to find more targets? The trouble was that his path had been blocked. He wasn't omnipotent, nor had he reached the point of being able to cover the island completely with his internal sight. As such, just like the other youths, he had to slowly explore the island, trying to find another entrance in. It was then that he was lucky enough to run into erupting volcano and was able to learn that it was precisely because this one entry point faced the location the Eastern Lookout youths entered the island that they were able to find it first, followed by those of the Southern Lookout. So, why was all this important? Why was it that Lionel was frozen in place, even to the point of becoming an anchor that stopped the youths from moving forward any longer? It was because the moment he reached the top of the hill, he saw an army. One shouldn't mistake these words to mean that a group of humans were below. No. Each and every one of those soldiers in Lionel's line of sight were beasts. They were separated by their species. One group of a few dozen was led by a large bear that stood at over 5 meters tall with brownish gold fur. Another was led by a tiger no smaller than the bear, except its stripes were a bright red gold instead of the normal black. Yet another was led by a snake over 10 meters long, covered in black scales. As if these three weren't imposing enough, there was still another 3. There was a spider with vicious steel incisors and countless beady red eyes. Its size was the smallest at just 3 meters in length, but such a thing hardly stopped its grotesque visage from displaying its full might. The next was a lemur, a monkey-like creature with a zebra-striped tail. It was far larger than it should have been, standing no shorter than the red-gold striped tiger. However, the last was maybe the most shocking of all. It didn't seem to be a beast at all. Or rather, it was, but had been stripped of all its flesh. It stood on all fours, not much unlike an ape would. From head to toe it was nothing but bone. Its body was covered in a faint transparent light that seemed to reflect the vision of an armor, but it would often flicker and disappear as though lacking the ability to maintain its own form. These 6 creatures were easily the most powerful. However, what truly shocked Lionel were the orderly soldiers to their backs. Each of them had a troop of their own, neatly arranged as though they truly were an army of humans rather than beasts. Each took control of their own species, wielding absolute authority. The golden brown bear had a troop of bears. The red-gold striped tiger had a legion of tigers. The black-scaled snake's troop filled the air with endless hissing. Each had their own centers of power. Even the bone ape had a legion of apes, though their flesh and blood was intact. Lionel quickly tried to calm his breathing. However, any hopes he had of not being noticed had already long since been thrown out the window. The instant he had made it to the top of the hill, he found 6 pairs of eyes trained on him. The bestial, murderous intent made it feel as though a bucket of ice water had fallen onto his head. His heartbeat involuntarily slowed. At that moment, the brownish gold bear roared and turned its head toward the spider legion. To Lionel's dismay, the spider's numerous beady red eyes landed on him once again, its mandibles snapping together in what looked like a response. Chapter 157. The youths who charged forward with Lionel paled. Their legs grew weak to the point some of them all but collapsed. There was even a good portion of them that wanted to turn and run this very moment. But, when they thought about the horde of beasts to their back, they realized that there really was no place to go. Were they really finished? Just like this? Some of them were here for a chance to enter an SS grade zone. Now that they thought about it, just how foolish were they? A single SS grade threat like the koi fish had stumped them for so many days already until Lionel came. Wasn't it too much of a joke to be striving for such a quota? The more they thought like this, the more they disparaged themselves and the greater their fear grew. In the distance, the horde of spiders was swiftly moving forward, their 8 limbs shimmering beneath the sunlight and slicing through the wind. They could only imagine what it would feel like being pierced by one of those things. How horrible would their deaths be? Though these youths were part of the Slayer Legion, their childhoods weren't much different from Lionel's. Fights between the Empire and the rebels were much rarer in those days compared to after the metamorphosis. It could only be said that they were marginally more prepared than other youths since they received military training. But now, they froze up. Facing a beast one-on-one was one thing, but suddenly facing over 100 charging forward like this made them feel as though their lives were already finished. This would really be their last day on this earth. Hey! Lionel suddenly roared, shocking them out of their thoughts. His voice was so loud that it traveled over a mile, even overshadowing the rushing sound of force surging out from the geyser up ahead. If you don't want to die, pull yourselves together. You see over there, there's a network of caves. Our goal is to cut through here and make it there. Then we might stand a chance. They'll take the vanguard, don't lose sight of my back. They all saw what Lionel was pointing toward. After the rolling hills of green the blue koi fish had called home, the land suddenly became bleak and desolate, filled with grayish-black gravel-like land. This bleak land was connected to the valley system that blocked their entrance from other regions. Without any context, it looked no different from a land of death. Nearer toward the center of this land of death, there was another hill. Though this hill wasn't as tall, it was very wide. It was made completely of dull grayish-black stone and had numerous holes of varying sizes dotted across its surface. In truth, it was more accurately described as a hive rather than a hill. The geyser of force, still jetting out into the skies, came out from this very hive, out of a hole at the very center of it all. Lionel could also tell that the origin of this geyser was incredibly deep underground. Thinking of the deep valley system, Lionel couldn't help but think that they were connected in some way. But even though he intuitively felt this, he didn't have the time to put his brain power toward trying to figure it out. The Spider Legion was already closing in. In the beginning they were over half a kilometer away, but now they were already less than half of that. We have the high ground right now, but trying to maintain this position is stupid. Those beasts seem to have intelligence, so if they see that the Spider Legion is losing, they won't just sit idly by. The good news is that they only sent one of the 6 groups after us, leaving a gap in their defenses we can take advantage of. The bad news is that we still need to make it through the Spider Legion and those other 5 legions if we want to seek refuge in that hive. Lionel gritted his teeth. He knew they needed to charge, there was no other way. The truth was that turning back to pierce through the horde of beasts toward their backs would be easier. They had far less organization and would definitely be weaker than this threat up ahead. But if they did that, then what? There were definitely even more beasts headed here from the ocean, having sensed the surge of force. If they couldn't deal with this problem in front of them, they would be finished. Lionel flipped his palm, a familiar spear appearing in his hand. Compared to the last time when its spearhead had been split by Hutch's blade, it had already been repaired. How could he come here without first comprehending spear force? After Lionel did this, the dictionary unlocked a lot of information about the spear domain ring for him. There were many useful things, but what was most important to him now was the fact that spears acknowledged by the ring can be repaired. Unfortunately, he had left the primitive man's spear outside for too long, causing its consciousness to dissipate. As a result, the ring no longer acknowledged it and was unable to repair it. But this primitive woman's spear was different. Not as much time had passed, and since it was just a low-level spear of the spear domain, it didn't even take an hour to repair fully. Lionel's aura completely changed, becoming even sharper and more violent than before. Seeing this, the youths inexplicably felt a sense of calm. Before, when the aura was aimed toward them, they found it difficult to even breathe. But now, having experienced the aura of protection Lionel's teammates had for so many years already, they suddenly felt their strength surging. Lionel took out the dictionary and slipped it into his pocket. With the situation like this, he couldn't afford to keep it hidden any longer. What's the weakness of that Spider King? Lionel's sudden words caught the youths who had just regained their bearing off guard once again. But they were even more shocked when there was an actual response. Ping replying to Seed, the seam between the head and body is a vital point. Lionel didn't even turn back after hearing this. Follow me, I'll carve out a path. He could feel his blood boiling. He understood that this was his true state. The state his lineage factor was meant to be in. Chapter 158. Hong. Lionel took a strong step forward. Lionel Morales, Force Amplified. Strength, 259, Speed, 238, Agility, 243, Coordination, 261, Stamina, 273 plus 0, 05 Nullified. Reactions, 263, Spirit, 292, Force, 060. The grass beneath his feet swayed wildly, being pressed down by his momentum as he took yet another step forward. Hong. Lionel Morales, Force and Spear Domain Lineage Factor Amplified. Strength, 285, Speed, 262, Agility, 267, Coordination, 287, Stamina, 273 plus 0, 05 Nullified. Reactions, 290, Spirit, 292, Force, 066. With Lionel as the center, billowing winds spread out, leaving a trail of concentric circles as though a helicopter was descending from above. At that moment, Lionel smiled lightly. I haven't gotten back to Aina yet, I have no intention of dying in this place. I'm sure you all heard that. Lionel said without turning back. Aim well. Lionel dashed forward, his speed so swift that it almost looked like his feet weren't touching the ground. To his back, the youths clenched their jaws. By now, in the chaos of the moment, those of the eastern and southern lookouts didn't have the luxury of continuing to remain separated. King of Seas and Pisces were still fuming over what happened earlier, but did they have much of a choice? If they didn't band together now, wouldn't their slim chance at survival become even slimmer than it already was? Still, despite the situation, those of the southern lookout had complicated feelings of their own. They couldn't help but feel odd about Lionel's actions to this point. Wasn't he supposed to be arrogant and insufferable? Someone with those kinds of personality traits would probably use their superior power to force them to act as meat shields. If it came down to it and Lionel forced them to take the vanguard, would they even be able to say no? Where would they go? Without a pillar of support like Lionel, what were their odds of survival? Lionel crossed the last line of grass and stepped onto the gravel-like land of death. To him, it simply didn't matter whether those to his back followed him or not. He was a person with a soft heart. This was precisely why he had taken on the role of their vanguard. However, it was impossible for him to put himself in any more danger should they choose to hesitate. The loose land beneath his feet was kicked up into the air as his hair whipped about wildly. There was something freeing knowing that all of his opponents were just beasts, as though an inhibition on his heart had been removed and he could finally let loose. At that moment, a familiar roar sounded behind Lionel, causing his lip to curl into a more prominent smile. It seemed that they had finally decided to follow. Call of the Wind. The ease with which Lionel used this technique simply couldn't be compared to the first time he had done so. It looked as though he had only casually flicked his wrist a few times, yet several lines of white curled in the air, finding the gap between the head and thorax of several spiders in the blink of an eye. Lionel could at most use this technique a few times in the past, but now using it over 100 wasn't an issue. Before he had even met the front line of the charging legion, almost a dozen large spiders had already fallen, their mandibles chopping at empty air. As expected, the smaller ones have the same weakness as the larger one. How could all of these spiders be of the same subspecies? Things would never be so convenient. Let alone this spider legion, even the legion of the tiger and bear weren't completely homogeneous. But what stood true was that like converged with like. The spider legion was mostly made up of various mutated arachnids and different kinds of insects. The tiger legion was most constructed of large cat-like beast. So on and so forth. Now that Lionel had a firm grasp of their weakness, he wouldn't allow them to stop his path forward. Especially not now that he had support coming to his back. In another few strides, Lionel had met the spider legion. The youths charging closely to his back couldn't help but be shocked by his dauntlessness. But, if they knew that Lionel's first trial in this world was facing an army of Spaniards with no weapon outside of a bicycle, they would think much differently. This fearlessness, this dauntlessness, the firmness of his stride and the straightness of his back. He had earned them all with his blood, sweat and tears. Lionel's movements became ethereal, his steps carrying a bit of the elegance of the primitive woman. As devastating as Call of the Wind was in the long range, in the short range it was even more so. Lionel carved a path, sliding past the sharp legs and chomping pincers of insects and spiders around him. If all he had to do was make it past, he would have long since stepped through the air. However, he held his ground firmly, every pierce of his spear reaping another life. Suddenly Lionel took his left hand off the staff of his spear, flipping his palm to reveal his pistol. His hips spun as he fired a single shot. In the distance, Precious' moment had fallen. She scrambled to pull back, ignoring the hard gravel scraping across her palms and bottom as she hurried back. The mandibles of a mantis-like creature snapped toward her, not caring for the tears and snot running down her face. "Amelia!" Seer roared from a battle to her side, but he knew he wouldn't make it in time. Disregarding himself, he pointed his staff toward the mantis, blowing it away. But before he could sigh in relief, he realized the spider he had been fighting was now free to attack him. A leg glistening like steel shot toward his chest. He could almost see the scene of his chest being pierced right through. However, he could have never expected a single shot to find its mark at that very moment. The spider had hardly raised its legs before it fell limply to the ground, unable to get up again. Seer looked toward the direction of the shot, only to find Lionel's back looking back at him. A feeling of gratefulness welled up in his chest. He fired that shot even before I saved Amelia. Just how did he predict what would happen? Unfortunately, this wasn't the time for him to ask this question, because his savior was facing his own problems now. After seeing Lionel take out so much of its own, the Spider King, which had been taking a backseat, suddenly couldn't any longer. Lionel's jaw steeled. "Give me a rundown of this spider's abilities." Chapter 159. Ping evolved life form detected. Kingdom, Animalia. Phylum, Arthropoda. Class, Arachnida. Order, Araneae. Infraorder, Mygalomorphae. Family, Theraphosidae. State, Evolved. Abilities, Ping generating nomenclature. Venomous touch, Tier 8 black grade venom detected. This venom has been infused with every fiber of this creature's being. Rebounding web, Spider silk with astonishing elasticity. Sturdy web, Spider silk Tier 7 black grade toughness. Weakness, between head and abdomen. Evaluating power, Ping. Evolution stage, Elite Tier 7 black. Lionel's brow furrowed. He had been very worried about the webs of these spiders when he charged, but he didn't expect that the matter would be even more troublesome than he originally thought. To make matters worse, this still wasn't considered an SS grade threat? Tier 7 black, that translated to S grade. But what was with the elite tag? What did that mean? Now that he thought about it, Lionel remembered that the octopus was classified as peak Tier 7 black. So there were separations like this? No matter how curious he was, Lionel knew that this wasn't a time to ask this question. All he needed to guess was that this spider was a greater threat than the octopus. Knowing this, he had to ask questions that could help him keep his life. Can my chain necklace block the toxicity? Ping replying to Seed, the energy shield can block about 80% of the venom's toxicity. Lionel's frown deepened, but his footsteps didn't stop. He dashed toward the spider, but when it seemed they would clash, he suddenly changed directions, headed off to the side with all the might he could muster. He knew that the spider would chase after him because all along the way, his spear had never stopped. He continued carving a path forward, outpacing the spider by a measure. Lionel could tell by the spider's stats that its speed was actually much higher than his own. However, its agility was very low. Making it navigate a battlefield like this, especially when it had to be careful not to poison its own legion, was about the best thing Lionel could do at this moment. Is there no other way to deal with the spider's venom? Lionel knew he needed to be incredibly specific when asking questions to the dictionary. It wouldn't simply offer him up answers based on the situation. So, Lionel had slowly learned to keep an open mind and ask things he might not usually ask. In his mind, he didn't have anything else that could deal with venom. But who knows if this was really true? Outside of his expectations, it seemed he was correct to ask. Ping Light Elemental Force has a strong healing effect and is the bane of many toxins. Seed's Light Elemental Force is still too low to be considered immune. Lionel's eyes widened. Too low? There are levels to Light Elemental Force? Lionel really didn't expect this. He thought that a force-strengthening deviation was as advertised. He didn't expect for there to be more. Ping yes. Even in the midst of the battlefield, Lionel couldn't help but curse under his breath. Couldn't this damn dictionary be a bit more forgiving? Why did every answer need to be so short and to the point? It really never touched on anything he didn't directly ask it. Lionel couldn't help but wonder how many things he had missed out on because of this. Forget it, now isn't the time to ask this. That damn spider is hot on my heels. Lionel knew he couldn't put too much effort into running away from this spider. Though he felt he could escape on his own, he was meant to be acting as a vanguard currently. If he strayed too far, instead of opening up a path, he would be allowing the other youths to get swallowed up. The youths who had come to this hunt still number about 80 or so. With such a number, even though they were still vastly outnumbered, it was definitely better than going in alone. Lionel needed them as much as he didn't have the heart to leave them here to die. So, he could only hope that the combination of his light elemental force and his energy shield was enough to hold out. Lionel's spear flickered forward, leaving after images in the air as he pierced another spider through. Compared to the massive 3-meter-long spider to his back, the ones before him were barely half a meter long. But were still far larger than what one would expect. The gross creature sent a chill up even Lionel's spine, but he still pushed them down his spear like a kebab before turning back and whipping them toward the quickly approaching spider. The spider leader's leg lashed out, slicing the soaring corpses in half with a single strike and causing a rain of green guts to fall from the sky. In that moment, its vision was obscured, allowing Lionel to rapidly close the distance. Lionel ducked down and slid across the gray gravel, trying to get beneath the spider's body to attack its weak point. But just as he was going to succeed, the spider leader seemed to realize that something was off. Its mouth opened, its mandible-like protrusions snapping as a violet fog fell from its mouth. Lionel quickly held his breath, explosively retreating. Damn dictionary. It said venomous touch, it never said anything about venomous fog. At that moment, a white strand of silk shot out like a bullet. No, it wasn't completely white. Beneath the sunlight, it reflected a slight hint of fluorescent purple. It was so subtle that even with his senses, Lionel almost didn't catch it. Lionel immediately recognized that this was the spider's true ability. He had wrongly accused the dictionary this time. Venomous touch was described as a venom infused into every fiber of the spider's being. That would include its breath. Damn! Lionel rolled out of the way in a sorry state, just barely managing to dodge the bullet of silk. But the insect beast behind him's cry of pain made it obvious that it wasn't so lucky. Lionel turned back to find it quickly turning purple, then black, then erupting into a cluster of dark fog and ash. If he didn't know better, he would think that it had been burned in a furnace. It was now that Lionel suddenly realized that maybe the other 5 legions of beasts hadn't made a mistake just sending the Spider King here. Chapter 160. Lionel's expression grew dignified. He was reluctant to use his light elemental force. It wasn't because he was trying to hide it, but because the consumption was too great. Not only did it drain his spirit, but it also drained his force at a much faster rate. Though his spear force also had the same impact on him, it wasn't nearly as exaggerated. But this also made sense since his spear force wasn't as powerful either. But at this point, what choice did he have? The dull color of Lionel's eyes suddenly lit brightly, a blinding glow shooting out from within their depths. Come on, you damn bug. Lionel flashed forward, leaving a streak of gold in his wake. He looked like a shooting star streaking across the battlefield, catching the eye of several of the youths battling for their lives. Their blood couldn't help but boil watching Lionel face up against this Spider King on his own. Was this his ability? They all seemed to have this thought. Lionel crossed into the foggy venom domain of the Spider King, sending several piercing strikes forward at once. The Spider King's response wasn't slow. Its sharp steel-like legs deflected the first few as its mandibles chopped at Lionel. When it saw Lionel retreat out of the way, another streak of silk shot from its mouth, heading directly for him. Shockingly, Lionel didn't dodge this time, facing the strike head-on as a pistol appeared in his hand, already loaded with a dart. Bang! Ugh. Lionel was sent flying. It felt as though the Spider King's projectile was a javelin crashing into his chest. His face turned red and bulged, only for a projectile of blood to fly from his mouth. The enraged and pain-filled roars of the spider caught the attention of the other legions of beasts, but they all hesitated to come forward. There was a reason they were still standing outside the large hill-like hive. They were waiting for the right opportunity to charge in and gain benefits for themselves. If they really left now, who knows what could happen. These beasts were obviously not stupid. Since this place had such a large pull toward them, it obviously had a massive pull toward others. This was why they were standing in this position. But, despite having evolved, their thoughts were still relatively simple and straightforward. It was difficult for them to respond with great flexibility. Before they could even make a decision, the situation changed again. The rumbling of beasts that came from out of the forest suddenly sounded much closer. They could only look over to find hundreds of wild beasts charging over the hills, barreling through and crossing into the gravel-filled lands. Compared to the beast legions with their respective kings, it was clear that these beasts had much less intelligence. Their tongues hung out from their mouths, a red tint coloring their eyes as though they had lost their minds. They wanted nothing more than to find the source of all this rich force. Another sharp crack rang out in Lionel's ears as he slid across the ground. He was very much familiar with this sound. He knew that his chain necklace had suffered another break. Sweeping his internal sight over it, his expression somewhat paled. The first break had caused its efficacy to drop by 10%. This time around, the treasure only had 70% of its initial strength left. Lionel didn't even have a mind to care about his current situation. This treasure had saved his life too many times already. If it really broke completely, it would be too great of a loss to swallow. He grit his teeth, glaring toward the screaming spider who seemed to not even have a mind to organize its own troops. I should have pierced its brain with that strike, but maybe I was too optimistic. I don't know anything about the anatomy of a spider, or maybe it didn't pierce that deeply. Lionel shook his head hard. Run. He snapped the youths who were too focused on battle out of it. They needed to take advantage of his beast tide to apply pressure on the other beast legions. If they were to get caught up in it, their last chance would go up in a puff of smoke. Lionel grit his teeth, ignoring the pain racking his body to stand. He sent a glance across the battlefield, sighing a faint breath of relief when he saw that everyone had managed to barely keep some forward momentum and, most importantly, stay together. Under Lionel's lead, they bolted toward the legion of beasts, their trail being followed by a tide of wild beasts. The spider legion didn't seem to know how to react with their leader screaming out and writhing in pain. They were soon swallowed by the beast tide. Lionel's heart almost beat out his chest with his every stride, once again swearing to himself that he would most definitely get some sort of transportation treasure. As he ran, Lionel looked down at his chest with a solemn expression. A web spread out, covering half his chest and his shoulder. With every passing moment, it ate into his energy shield, causing the cracks across it to grow. Damn it! Without a choice, Lionel took off his tight, black compression shirt before it could continue to corrode the energy shield. He coughed violently, unable to mind the state of his body as he ran. He really couldn't believe it. He thought that by now, facing even an SSS-grade threat wouldn't put him in too sorry of a position. But now he had suddenly found out that there were still S-grade threats that could push him to this state. At a time like this, he couldn't help but lament that his ability was auxiliary and not attack-based. Lionel shook his head as the distance between him and the 5 legions closed. He once again heard roaring black lions' roar sound out from his back. He didn't need to look back to know the beast tide had slowed somewhat because he could clearly see that even that beasts up ahead were greatly affected. Lionel didn't have the mind to care about anything else. All of his being was focused on charging through the gap left by the Spider Legion. He wouldn't let anything stop him. His oppressive aura involuntarily shot out from his body, covering the lands before him in a layer of oppression. Chapter 161. Lionel controlled his speed. He was more than capable of leaving the trailing youths to his back far behind, but would doing this benefit him? If anything, it would put him in danger. Not only did he need to maintain their pace such that they were ahead of the beast tide, he needed to ensure they could also remain together. With him in the lead, he perfectly took into account the speed and stamina stats of everyone. By now, any youth worthy of being part of this group had a complete set of stats above 1.00. This was more than enough to cross the remaining 400 or so meters in just half a minute. They had already crossed half the distance before the legion of beasts couldn't sit idly any longer. Lionel didn't know why it was that they were still waiting, but what he was certain of was that they didn't want anyone entering before they did. The brownish gold bear stepped forward, roaring as though giving a warning. The beast tied behind the group of youths faltered for a moment, but it seemed that they had completely lost all reasoning. It was clear that this fact completely enraged the brownish gold bear. He raised up onto his hind legs, billowing into the skies before slamming his front paws down. The earth suddenly became turbulent. It seemed for a moment that nothing would happen, but then an earthen tide suddenly rose into the skies, causing Lionel's expression to change violently. Earth control? This bear needs to die. The moment Lionel made the decision, he didn't hesitate. The only chance for him and the youths with him to survive was to enter the hive network, making use of the network of tunnels to both hide and find a path toward the source of the force geyser. However, if there was an earth-controlling beast that entered into a network of tunnels with them, they wouldn't even know how they died. If others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think he was crazy. Though his line of thinking was correct, how could he possibly spare time for such a thing? Anyone else would focus on surviving this situation first, then worry about what came later. However, Lionel had been a star quarterback. Every move he made on the football field considered what might happen 5, 10, even 20 plays later. Sometimes, it wasn't worth taking a victory if it guaranteed a loss later. Likewise, it was sometimes worth it to eat a loss for the sake of ultimately grasping victory. Looking at the compression shirt in his hand, Lionel's eyes flashed. "Do your best to dodge." Lionel roared. There was a limit to his abilities. While he could put himself on the line to deal with this beast, he couldn't also help them all dodge this attack. But he wasn't worried. These were all promising youths for a reason. Without hesitation, Lionel's speed suddenly doubled, then doubled again. He looked like a streak of light tearing across the graveled land, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. He leapt over the 3-meter wall of earth with absolute ease. By now, his distance from the Bear King had already shrunk to 50 meters. At this point, he could even see the reflections in its large black eyes. He could sense its fury, its rage, its killing intent. But his heart remained steady. 40 meters. 30 meters. 20 meters. Roar. Seemingly worried about the coming beast tide, the Bear King didn't force his legion to charge toward Lionel. Plus, in its mind, how could he possibly not be able to deal with a single human by itself? The size difference was striking. The bear stood at over 5 meters tall, yet Lionel was barely 2. Even the former's palm seemed capable of swatting him into a meat patty, but Lionel dauntlessly approached. At that moment, the Bear King seemed to sense Lionel's oppressive aura. Its rage had muddled its senses for a moment, but once Lionel came so close, it felt to him that hell had suddenly descended. The bear was shocked for a moment, only to find that Lionel had suddenly appeared in the air above it, pointing a black shirt at it. Confusion colored the bear's features. Why was this human pointing a piece of cloth at it? The Bear King's intelligence was just starting to develop, but the scene before it was completely baffling. It couldn't combine the threatening aura it felt from the human with the scene before it. For the first time, a beast would pay a price for its rising intelligence. If it was still a normal bear, it wouldn't have hesitated to turn and run. It didn't have emotions like pride, it only had instincts of survival. But by now it had grown the fondness for kingship. It had become intoxicated with power. It had already sent the spider forward before, causing it to suffer a major setback. If it didn't step up now, the other beast kings would be dissatisfied. This was his role to take on. Bang! The moment it opened its mouth to roar its fear away, a searing pain ripped through its tongue and throat. At first, it was the pain of having its flesh torn and pierced. But, in what felt like an instant, its vision grew blurry. It happened so quickly that the human that had been standing in the air above it didn't even have time to land on the ground before its inner organs were completely corroded. Lionel sucked in a cold breath as the bear collapsed. He had known that the Spider King's poison would be potent, but he most definitely didn't expect it to be so exaggerated. He couldn't help but feel a cold shiver run down his spine. If it wasn't for his chain necklace, he would be finished. After taking a look at the fourth nozzle he had completely ruined, Lionel sighed, landing on the ground heavily. With a dull bang, the Bear King fell to the ground. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.